There's a philosopher who claimed your entire life is a cosmic scam. Every time you've fallen in love, you were being manipulated by biology. Every achievement you've celebrated, temporary relief before the next craving hits. Every fear of death you felt, complete delusion about nothing. Arthur Schopenhauer looked at the same reality everyone else sees and called it a trap. You're caught in a machine that generates suffering, and every attempt to escape just tightens the grip. He lived like he meant it, ate alone at the same restaurant every single day, same table, same time, reading the same newspaper. Kept loaded pistols by his bed, convinced someone was coming to kill him. Walked the same route for exactly 2 hours, regardless of weather. He wrote a book that he knew would change philosophy forever. He was 30 years old and absolutely certain. He sent it to the greatest minds in Europe and waited for the recognition he deserved. Nobody cared. The book sat in warehouses. Years passed. Most copies were destroyed, literally pulped back into raw paper, because nobody wanted them. He tried teaching, scheduled his lectures at the exact same time as the most famous philosopher in Germany. He sat in an empty classroom while crowds packed the room next door. His own mother told him his miserable personality guaranteed he'd die unknown and forgotten. They never spoke again. For 20 years, he lived in silence. No recognition, no readers, no acknowledgement that he'd solved the riddle of existence. Just the same rigid routine in a Frankfurt apartment, alone except for his dog, playing the same flute pieces every day at noon, convinced the world was wrong and he was right. Then at 65, people started reading. Students appeared at his door. His books sold. The recognition came exactly as he'd always known it would, but by then, he no longer cared. Arthur Schopenhauer was born on February 22, 1788, in the free city of Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, was a wealthy merchant with Republican ideals and a deep distrust of authority. His mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, would later become a successful novelist and salon host, though their relationship would become one of the most bitter in philosophical history. The family wealth came from generations of successful trade. Heinrich wanted his son to continue the business legacy, not waste time with books and ideas. When Arthur was 5, the family moved to Hamburg to escape Prussian annexation. Heinrich valued independence above all else and structured his son's education around this principle. Between 1797 and 1799, young Arthur lived with a family in Le Havre, France, learning French and observing commercial life. He hated it. In 1803, Heinrich offered his son a choice: continue education in humanities, or join him on a European tour, after which Arthur would commit to commerce. Arthur chose the journey. For 2 years, they traveled through Holland, England, France, Switzerland, Austria, and Prussia. In London, Arthur was appalled by poverty and industrial squalor. In Toulon, he witnessed the brutality of galley slaves. These observations of human suffering marked him permanently. When they returned to Hamburg in 1805, Arthur began his apprenticeship at a merchant house. He despised every moment. Then, in April 1805, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer died. The official cause was drowning in a canal behind their warehouse. Whether accident, suicide, or something else remains unclear. Arthur was 17. The death liberated him from commercial obligations, but burdened him with guilt and questions he would never answer. His mother Johanna moved to Weimar with Arthur's younger sister Adele. She was relieved to be free from her unhappy marriage and eager to start a new life. She established a literary salon that attracted Goethe, the Grimm brothers, and other luminaries. Arthur joined her in 1807, but the reunion was catastrophic. Johanna found her son gloomy and unbearable. Arthur found his mother superficial and callous about his father's death. She once told him his constant pessimism would ensure he would never be famous. He replied that his works would still be read long after her forgotten novels had turned to dust. He was right. In 1809, Arthur enrolled at the University of Göttingen to study medicine, but quickly switched to philosophy. He studied Plato and Kant intensively. Kant's division between the phenomenal world of appearances and the noumenal world of things in themselves became the foundation for his own thinking. In 1811, he moved to Berlin to study under Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the idealist philosopher then at the height of his fame. Schopenhauer attended Fichte's lectures and found them worthless. He filled his notebooks with contemptuous marginal notes, calling Fichte a charlatan and a windbag. When Napoleon's armies approached Berlin in 1813, Schopenhauer fled. He had no interest in nationalist fervor or military glory. He considered warfare organized murder and nationalism collective insanity. He moved to Rudolstadt, a small town where he could work in peace. There, in isolation, he began writing his doctoral dissertation on the principle of sufficient reason. He completed it quickly and submitted it to the University of Jena, which awarded him a doctorate in absentia in 1813. He was 25. Around this time, Schopenhauer encountered Eastern philosophy. A friend introduced him to the Upanishads in Latin translation. The discovery was transformative. He found in Hindu and Buddhist texts a confirmation of his own intuitions about existence, suffering, and liberation. He would later say the Upanishads were the consolation of his life and would be the consolation of his death. Between 1814 and 1818, Schopenhauer worked on his magnum opus while living in Dresden. He isolated himself almost completely, working with obsessive discipline. He walked every day at exactly the same time. He ate at the same restaurant. He avoided social contact. The book he was writing, The World as Will and Representation, would contain his entire philosophical system. He believed he had solved the fundamental riddle of existence. The book was published in December 1818. Schopenhauer was 30 years old and completely convinced he had written one of the most important works in human history. He waited for the recognition he knew he deserved. It never came. The book was almost entirely ignored. A handful of reviews appeared, most dismissive or confused. The publisher later admitted that most printed copies had been pulped as waste paper. Schopenhauer was devastated, but not deterred. He believed the problem was not his work, but the corrupt state of contemporary philosophy. German universities were dominated by Hegel and his followers, who preached historical progress and rational optimism. Schopenhauer saw this as fraud. He despised Hegel with a passion that bordered on obsession. In 1820, Schopenhauer applied for a position as lecturer at the University of Berlin, where Hegel held the most prestigious chair. He was accepted, and in an act of spectacular arrogance, he scheduled his lectures at exactly the same time as Hegel's. Students flocked to Hegel. Schopenhauer lectured to nearly empty rooms. After one semester, he abandoned his academic career. He would never hold a university position again. This failure was compounded by personal disaster. In 1821, a seamstress named Caroline Marquet accused Schopenhauer of assaulting her during an argument outside his apartment. She claimed he had pushed her down the stairs, causing permanent injury. The case dragged on for years. In 1827, a court ordered Schopenhauer to pay her compensation every quarter for the next 20 years. When she died in 1842, he wrote in his account book, "The old woman dies, the burden departs." After the Berlin debacle, Schopenhauer wandered restlessly. He briefly lived in Italy, returned to Berlin, fled a cholera epidemic in 1831 that killed Hegel, and eventually settled in Frankfurt in 1833. He was 45 years old. He would remain there for the rest of his life. In Frankfurt, Schopenhauer established the routine that would define his remaining years. He lived alone in a modest apartment with a succession of poodles, all named Atma. He woke every morning at 7, wrote until noon, played the flute for half an hour, then took a 2-hour walk regardless of weather. He ate lunch at the same inn at the same table, reading the Times of London. Evenings he spent reading or attending the theater. He spoke to almost no one. His isolation was partly chosen and partly enforced. He had no family connections. His mother died in 1838, and they had not spoken in years. His sister Adele remained distant. He never married, never had children, and maintained no close friendships. He visited prostitutes regularly and without shame, considering sexual desire a biological necessity that should never be confused with love or commitment. For nearly 2 decades, Schopenhauer remained virtually unknown. He published essays and supplements to his main work, but they attracted little attention. He grew bitter, paranoid, and increasingly misanthropic. He kept loaded pistols by his bedside. He trusted no one and suspected everyone of trying to steal his ideas. Then, slowly, things began to change. In the late 1840s and early 1850s, a few intellectuals discovered his work and recognized its power. In 1851, he published Parerga and Paralipomena, a collection of essays written in a more accessible style. One essay on the wisdom of life became moderately popular. Suddenly, at age 65, Schopenhauer began receiving recognition. Students sought him out. Admirers sent letters. Universities that had ignored him now acknowledged his contributions. Richard Wagner visited him and declared himself a disciple. Young philosophers made pilgrimages to Frankfurt to catch a glimpse of the solitary old man with white hair and penetrating blue eyes. Schopenhauer enjoyed his late fame immensely. He collected every review, every mention of his name. He became friendlier, more talkative, almost sociable. But he never softened his views or compromised his positions. He remained convinced that life was suffering, that the world was fundamentally irrational, and that most people were fools. On September 21st, 1860, Arthur Schopenhauer died alone in his apartment. He was 72 years old. He died sitting in his chair, apparently of heart failure. His poodle Atma was with him. Most of his substantial estate went to charity, funding scholarships for children of disabled soldiers. He left behind a philosophical system built on suffering, will, and the possibility of escape through art, compassion, and renunciation. He had lived exactly as his philosophy prescribed, alone, disciplined, desiring little, seeking truth above comfort. why life is suffering, and he wasn't just being dramatic. Schopenhauer's philosophy begins with a simple observation that most people spend their lives trying to avoid. Existence hurts. Not occasionally, not in exceptional circumstances, but fundamentally and continuously. This was not depression speaking. It was the result of careful observation and logical reasoning. He looked at life without comforting stories and described what he saw. The argument starts with desire. Every living thing wants something. A plant wants light and water. An animal wants food and safety. A human wants thousands of things: food, shelter, respect, love, success, pleasure, meaning. The moment one desire is satisfied, another emerges. You are hungry, then you eat, then you are tired, then you sleep, then you are bored. The cycle never stops. Desire, in Schopenhauer's analysis, is suffering. To want something is to lack it. To lack something is to experience deficiency, incompleteness, pain. The very structure of wanting guarantees dissatisfaction. You are always moving towards something you do not have, always feeling the gap between your current state and your desired state. This gap is suffering. Most philosophers before Schopenhauer assumed suffering was a deviation from the natural state, something that could be eliminated through reason, virtue, or progress. Schopenhauer inverted this. Suffering is the natural state. Satisfaction is the deviation, and it is always temporary. You can satisfy a specific desire, but you cannot eliminate desire itself. When one want is fulfilled, the underlying structure of wanting remains and immediately generates new wants. He used hunger as his clearest example. Hunger is painful. Eating removes the pain temporarily, but eating does not end hunger permanently. A few hours later, hunger returns. You are not eating to achieve some final state of being permanently fed. You are eating to postpone the inevitable return of hunger. All human activity follows this pattern. We do not solve problems, we postpone them. Schopenhauer divided suffering into three categories. First is the suffering of unfulfilled desire. You want something and do not have it. Second is the suffering of fulfilled desire. When you get what you want, satisfaction lasts only moments before boredom sets in. Boredom is not trivial. It is existential suffering, the experience of existence itself as burdensome when desire temporarily falls silent. Third is suffering caused by obstacles and opposition. Life is full of frustrations, failures, losses, and pain inflicted by circumstance or other people. Between these three forms, there is no escape within normal living. You are either in want, in boredom, or in pain. Schopenhauer summarized it simply. Life swings like a pendulum between suffering and boredom, with brief moments of satisfaction serving merely as transitions between the two. He supported this analysis with observations from biology and everyday life. Look at the animal kingdom. Every creature is engaged in a desperate struggle for survival. They hunt or are hunted. They compete for resources and territory. Their entire existence consists of fear, hunger, exhaustion, and brief interludes of reproduction or rest. Nature is not harmonious. It is a war of all against all, with every organism trying to sustain itself at the expense of others. Humans are no different, just more complicated. We have the same basic drives, but have layered onto them elaborate structures of social ambition, intellectual vanity, and existential anxiety. Animals suffer, but do not reflect on their suffering. Humans suffer and know they are suffering, which makes it worse. We can anticipate future suffering, remember past suffering, and imagine suffering that may never occur. Our intelligence magnifies our pain. Schopenhauer noted the asymmetry between pleasure and pain. Pain is positive and immediate. When you are in pain, you know it directly and intensely. Pleasure, by contrast, is merely the absence or reduction of pain. What we call pleasure is really just relief. Health is the absence of illness. Safety is the absence of danger. Satisfaction is the temporary absence of desire. We do not experience happiness as a positive state. We experience it as a reduction in suffering. This is why we notice pain more than pleasure. Losing something hurts more than gaining something feels good. A single misfortune can erase contentment built by many small pleasures. While pain is limitless in intensity and duration, pleasure is always limited. You can suffer excruciating agony for hours or years, but intense pleasure lasts minutes at most before diminishing into normalcy or boredom. He examined different life strategies to see if any avoided this fundamental structure. Wealth does not eliminate suffering, it merely changes its form. The poor suffer from deprivation, the rich suffer from boredom, anxiety about losing wealth, and the hollowness of satisfied desires. Intelligence does not help. Clever people suffer more because they see more clearly the futility of their strivings. Beauty, health, talent, none of these protect against the underlying condition. He was not advocating suicide. That would be pointless because suicide does not negate the will to live. It merely expresses it in a distorted form. The person who commits suicide is not rejecting life itself, but rejecting a particular life situation they find unbearable. They still crave existence, just a different one. Changing circumstances would not eliminate suffering, only alter its manifestation. Schopenhauer insisted this analysis was not pessimism, but realism. Optimists were either lying or deluded. They ignored evidence, told comforting stories, and refused to look clearly at the nature of existence. He was simply describing what anyone could see if they paid attention without filtering reality through wishful thinking. He acknowledged that people occasionally experience moments of genuine joy, aesthetic experiences, moments of compassion, the satisfaction of understanding, but these moments do not negate the fundamental analysis. They are exceptions, brief reprieves, and significantly, these moments share a common feature. They all involve a temporary cessation of desire. In aesthetic experience, you stop wanting and simply perceive. In compassion, you momentarily forget your own desires. In understanding, you transcend personal striving. This observation pointed toward possible solutions, but before exploring solutions, Schopenhauer insisted on fully facing the problem. Most philosophy, most religion, most human thought consists of avoidance mechanisms. People invent gods who care about them, create narratives of progress, tell themselves suffering has a purpose. These are coping mechanisms, not truths. He traced this avoidance to the will itself. The will to live does not want to acknowledge its own nature because that acknowledgement threatens its operation. If you fully understood that existence is suffering and that all desires lead only to more suffering, you might stop desiring. The will cannot permit this, so it generates illusions and false hopes that keep you striving. This creates a peculiar situation. The thing inside you that drives all your actions is fundamentally at odds with your well-being. It does not care whether you are happy. It cares only that you continue wanting and striving. Your suffering is irrelevant to it, or rather, your suffering is its tool for keeping you in motion. Schopenhauer saw this most clearly in sexual desire. The intensity of sexual attraction, the obsessive quality of romantic love, the lengths to which people will go to satisfy erotic desires. None of this serves the individual's happiness. It serves the species' continuation. Nature tricks you into reproducing by making you think you desire a particular person, when really you are being manipulated by biological imperatives that have nothing to do with your fulfillment. Understanding this does not immediately end suffering, but it is the necessary first step. You cannot address a problem you refuse to acknowledge. Most people die without ever clearly seeing the nature of their situation. They remain trapped in cycles of desire and disappointment, telling themselves stories to make it bearable, never confronting the fundamental structure that generates their pain. Schopenhauer offered this analysis not to depress people, but to liberate them. Only by seeing clearly what you are dealing with can you begin to find ways to minimize suffering and occasionally transcend it. The recognition that life is suffering is not the end of philosophy. It is the beginning. Will to live, the blind force that controls everything. Behind the world of appearances, the world of objects, people, and events we experience through our senses, Schopenhauer claimed there exists a single underlying reality. He called it the will. Not your individual will, your personal desires and intentions, but something far more fundamental. A blind, aimless, endless force that manifests itself in everything that exists. This was Schopenhauer's central metaphysical claim. Kant had argued that we can never know things as they are in themselves, only as they appear through the structures of space, time, and causality that our minds impose on experience. Schopenhauer agreed, but claimed he had found the one exception. We know the thing in itself directly because we are it. The will is not something we observe from outside. It is what we are from inside. When you feel hunger, desire, fear, or any impulse to act, you are experiencing the will directly. You are not observing it as an object in space or an event in time. You are being it. This immediate awareness of your own inner drive is your only direct contact with reality as it is in itself, not as it appears through the filters of perception and thought. Schopenhauer then made a crucial leap. This will you experience in yourself is not unique to you. It is the inner nature of everything. A stone falling to earth, a plant growing toward light, an animal hunting prey, a human pursuing ambition. All these are manifestations of the same fundamental force. The forms differ, the level of consciousness differs, but the underlying drive is identical, a blind urge toward existence, toward continuation, toward more. He called it the will to live, though this is slightly misleading. The will does not will to live in the sense of having a goal or making a decision. It is not conscious. It does not think or plan. It simply is, an endless, purposeless striving that has no aim beyond its own continuation. It does not will life because life would be good or valuable. It wills life because willing is what it does. This will is entirely indifferent to individuals. You feel as though your desires are yours, personal, and important, but from the perspective of the will, you are merely one temporary manifestation among countless others. The will operates through you, but it would operate just as well through someone else if you ceased to exist. Your specific identity, your thoughts, your experiences, these matter to you, but not to the will. Schopenhauer found evidence for this in every domain. In physics, the will manifests as gravity, magnetism, and fundamental forces that drive matter. These forces do not think or choose. They simply act according to their nature, endlessly and automatically. In biology, the will manifests as the drive to survive and reproduce. Every organism struggles to maintain itself and create offspring, not because this serves some higher purpose, but because organisms that do not do this cease to exist. In human psychology, the will manifests as desire in all its forms. You want food, safety, sex, status, meaning, and 1,000 other things. These wants feel like they come from you, but they come through you. The will generates them, and you experience yourself as the desirer. But if you examine closely, you will notice that you do not choose your desires. They arise unbidden. You can sometimes choose whether to act on a desire, but you cannot choose whether to have it. The will is also one, not many. Although the will manifests in billions of individual organisms, all apparently separate and distinct, these are merely surface-level individuations. At the deepest level, there is no multiplicity, only a single will appearing in countless forms. When a cat kills a mouse, the will is effectively at war with itself. When humans compete or harm each other, the will is frustrating itself. All conflict, all suffering, all the struggle of existence is the will divided against itself by the illusion of individuation. This explains something that had puzzled philosophers, why existence is characterized by universal struggle and suffering. If the world were created by a rational, benevolent deity, or if it evolved towards some good purpose, you would expect harmony and happiness. Instead, you find conflict and pain everywhere. Schopenhauer's answer: the world is not rational and has no purpose. It is the blind manifestation of an irrational force that cares nothing for harmony. The will objectifies itself at different levels. At the lowest level are the forces of nature, gravity, chemical attraction, basic physical drives. These operate with complete regularity and no consciousness. At higher levels come plants, then animals with consciousness and the ability to suffer. At the highest level are humans, who have not only consciousness, but self-consciousness, the ability to reflect on their own existence. This hierarchy is not progress towards something better. It is simply increased complexity in the will's manifestation. And increased complexity means increased suffering. A stone cannot suffer. A plant suffers minimally. An animal suffers considerably. A human, capable of memory, anticipation, imagination, and self-awareness, suffers most of all. Intelligence is not a gift. It is an intensification of the problem. Schopenhauer's concept of the will explained many phenomena. Why do we often act against our rational interests? Because the will is not rational and does not care about your interests. Why is sexual desire so powerful and often destructive? Because sex is the will's primary mechanism for perpetuating itself, and it will sacrifice your happiness without hesitation. Why do we fear death intensely, even when life is painful? Because the will to live is the fundamental drive, and death represents its negation. The will also explained the structure of the natural world. Nature is characterized by competition, predation, and waste because the will, being blind and purposeless, generates endless forms without any overall plan. Species evolve not toward perfection, but simply toward greater efficacy in surviving and reproducing. The beauty people see in nature is superficial. Beneath it lies endless slaughter and meaningless repetition. The will always wants more than it can have. There is never enough food, territory, or mates for every organism. Scarcity is built into existence because desire is infinite while resources are finite. This guarantees eternal conflict. Every being wants to live, but living requires resources, and resources are limited. Therefore, beings must compete, and most must lose. In humans, this manifests as the impossibility of lasting satisfaction. You achieve a goal, and immediately the will generates a new goal. You acquire wealth, and you desire more or fear losing what you have. You win love, and you become anxious about keeping it, or bored with it. The will never says enough. It cannot, because rest would mean its cessation, and the will exists only as striving. Schopenhauer saw the will as fundamentally evil, though not in a moral sense. It is evil in the sense of being the source of suffering, conflict, and meaninglessness. It creates beings capable of suffering, and then ensures they will suffer. It divides itself into separate entities and makes them fight each other. It operates without purpose, without mercy, and without end. This metaphysical picture was profoundly disturbing. Most Western philosophy and religion assumed reality is ultimately rational, good, or meaningful. Schopenhauer rejected all of this. Reality is not rational. It is blind striving. It is not good. It is the source of suffering. It does not progress toward anything. It merely repeats itself endlessly. Yet this analysis was not meant to be nihilistic. Schopenhauer believed that understanding the true nature of the will was essential for finding relief from suffering. Only by seeing clearly what you are dealing with can you begin to work against it. The will can be resisted. It operates through your individual consciousness, but consciousness is not identical to the will. In moments of aesthetic experience, intellectual understanding, or genuine compassion, consciousness can temporarily free itself from the will's demands. These moments do not destroy the will. Nothing can do that while you are alive, but they provide relief, brief experiences of peace when striving stops. Understanding that your desires come from the will, not from your true self, creates distance from them. You can begin to see your wants as impositions rather than as expressions of who you are. This does not make desire disappear, but it weakens its grip. You suffer less when you recognize that the drive tormenting you is not you, just a blind force operating through you. Recognizing the unity of the will, that all beings are fundamentally the same while appearing in different forms, was, for Schopenhauer, the basis for compassion. When you harm another being, you are harming yourself at the deepest level because there is no ultimate separation. This insight was what genuinely moral behavior rested on, not rules or divine commands, but the recognition of essential identity with all that suffers. The will, then, was both the problem and the key to understanding the problem. It explained why existence is suffering, but it also pointed toward how suffering might be reduced. The rest of Schopenhauer's philosophy consisted of exploring strategies for minimizing the will's control over consciousness and occasionally achieving states of peace where the will falls silent and existence becomes briefly bearable. The man who hated noise and almost killed his neighbor. Arthur Schopenhauer did not merely theorize about suffering, he lived it, and much of that suffering was self-inflicted through his own impossible personality. His daily life in Frankfurt revealed a man who practiced what he preached about the will's tyranny, but also a man whose eccentricities bordered on pathology. Noise was his particular torment. He could not tolerate it. The sound of conversation through walls, footsteps on stairs, the crack of a whip in the street, any unexpected sound sent him into rage. He believed noise was not merely unpleasant, but a form of violence against thought. Sudden, sharp sounds physically interrupt the flow of thinking, making sustained intellectual work impossible. For a philosopher whose entire life revolved around contemplation, noise was equivalent to assault. His apartment in Frankfurt was chosen specifically for quiet. He kept windows closed even in summer. He lined his study with heavy curtains. When construction began on a neighboring building, he seriously considered moving to another city. Workmen hammering during his writing hours felt to him like deliberate torture. The incident with Caroline Marquet began with noise. In 1821, while living in Berlin, 3 women, including Marquet, a seamstress, would regularly gather outside his apartment to talk. Their conversations disturbed his work. He asked them repeatedly to move elsewhere. They refused or ignored him. His requests became demands. The situation escalated. One day in August, Schopenhauer emerged from his apartment while the women were talking in the hallway. An argument began. What happened next was disputed. According to Marquet, Schopenhauer physically grabbed her and threw her down the stairs, causing injuries that left her permanently disabled. According to Schopenhauer, he merely pushed her aside to pass, and she fell accidentally. The court initially ruled in his favor, but Marquet appealed. In 1827, the court reversed its decision and ordered Schopenhauer to pay Marquet compensation as long as she lived. For 20 years, Schopenhauer sent money every quarter to a woman he despised, a constant reminder of his loss of control. When she died in 1842, he made his infamous notation, "The old woman dies, the burden departs." It was petty, bitter, and entirely characteristic. His daily routine in Frankfurt was rigid to the point of compulsion. He woke at 7 every morning without an alarm. He washed with cold water, drank strong coffee, and sat down to write. He worked until noon without interruption. Anyone who disturbed him during these hours was met with fury. His housekeeper learned to move silently and speak only when necessary. At noon, he stopped writing and played his flute for exactly 30 minutes. He was not particularly talented, but he played every day without fail, mostly Mozart and Rossini. Music was not entertainment, but metaphysical necessity, a daily practice of will negation. After playing, he prepared for his walk. The walk was sacred. Every day, regardless of weather, he walked for exactly 2 hours. He followed the same route along the River Main and through the parks. He walked briskly, intensely focused, often stopping to observe something. Fellow walkers learned to recognize the solitary figure with white hair and piercing blue eyes, always alone, never acknowledging greetings. He carried a walking stick, not for support, but as a weapon. He was convinced he might be attacked and needed defense. This paranoia was baseless. Frankfurt was peaceful, and Schopenhauer was nobody's target. But he had constructed a mental world in which threats lurked everywhere. He trusted no one and assumed malice in every ambiguous situation. After his walk, he ate lunch at the Englischer Hof, a hotel restaurant. He sat at the same table every day by the window. He ate alone, always, reading the Times of London. The waiters knew not to speak unless necessary. He left the same tip calculated to the exact percentage he considered appropriate. Not generous, not stingy, precisely correct. His meals were simple. He preferred roast meat, plain vegetables, and bread. He drank wine, but never to excess. Gluttony offended him as a mindless form of will submission. He ate to sustain his body for thinking, nothing more. People who ate for pleasure or talked endlessly about food struck him as contemptible. After lunch, he returned to his apartment and read for several hours. His library was extensive and chaotic. Books were piled on every surface, marked with marginalia in multiple languages. He read widely, but always critically, arguing with authors in the margins. Very few writers met his standards. Most were dismissed as fools or frauds. Evenings he spent at the theater or opera. He attended regularly, sitting in the same seat, arriving exactly at curtain time and leaving immediately when performances ended. He never socialized. He was there for art, not social contact. He particularly loved Italian opera and Shakespeare, both of which he considered supreme achievements of aesthetic expression. His apartment reflected his personality. It was orderly but not comfortable. Furniture was functional and minimal. Decorations were few. Some artwork, a bust of Kant, little else. The rooms felt cold, designed for work rather than living. He employed a housekeeper, but kept her at emotional distance. She maintained order and prepared basic meals, nothing more. His relationship with his poodles was his closest approach to affection. He owned a succession of dogs, all named Atma, a reference to the Hindu concept of the world's soul. He talked to them, walked with them, and allowed them privileges he would never grant humans. The dogs were less threatening. They made no intellectual demands, posed no challenges to his ego, and provided companionship without complications. He never married and claimed to have no regrets. He considered marriage a trap, a mechanism by which the will enslaved men to its reproductive purposes. He had affairs and visited prostitutes regularly, viewing sex as a biological necessity that should never be confused with love or commitment. Love, he insisted, was the will's con game, making people think they desired a person when really they were being manipulated to reproduce. His misogyny was pronounced. He wrote essays arguing that women were intellectually inferior, emotionally unstable, and naturally suited only for child-rearing. These views were extreme even for his time. They seemed to stem partly from his bitter relationship with his mother, partly from general misanthropy, and partly from resentment at sexual desire itself, which he saw as the will's most powerful weapon against male reason. His paranoia extended beyond personal safety. He kept money in multiple banks, convinced any single institution might fail or defraud him. He never told anyone how much wealth he possessed. He suspected his housekeeper of stealing, though there was no evidence. He believed other philosophers were plagiarizing his ideas or conspiring to suppress his work. Most of these fears were groundless, products of isolation and temperament. Yet for all his unlikable qualities, people who met him in later years often reported a different impression. He could be charming when he chose, witty and well-informed. He enjoyed conversation when it met his standards. Students who sought him out sometimes found him generous with his time and ideas. He was capable of kindness, just rarely motivated to display it. His hypochondria was legendary. He was obsessed with health and disease, convinced he was constantly on the verge of serious illness despite being physically robust. He took daily cold baths, which he believed prevented illness. He avoided sick people, crowds during epidemics, and any situation that might expose him to contagion. When cholera struck Berlin in 1831, killing Hegel, Schopenhauer fled immediately. He slept with loaded pistols by his bedside until his final years. He was convinced someone would break in to rob or kill him. The fact that nothing ever happened did not shake this conviction. In his mind, the absence of attacks proved only that his precautions were working. This is the logic of paranoia: unfalsifiable, self-reinforcing, immune to evidence. His will, written and rewritten multiple times, reflected his character. It was precise, detailed, and misanthropic. Most of his substantial estate went to charities, particularly funds for disabled soldiers. Almost nothing went to family or friends because he had neither. The will specified exactly how his papers should be handled and which works should be republished. Even in death, he tried to maintain control. His final years brought recognition, but it did not soften him. Fame arrived too late to change his essential nature. He enjoyed seeing his books reviewed, but he remained suspicious, critical, and alone. He never learned to trust people or lower his defenses. The walls he had built were permanent. He died as he had lived, alone, except for his dog, in his apartment, surrounded by books. When his body was discovered, he was sitting in his chair as if he had simply fallen asleep. There was no struggle, no apparent suffering. For a man who had spent his life analyzing suffering, the end was as peaceful as one could hope. His eccentricities were not separate from his philosophy. They were its embodiment. His hatred of noise reflected his belief that the world constantly impinges on consciousness, making peace impossible. His rigid routine was an attempt to minimize the will's influence. His isolation reflected his conviction that other people are primarily sources of suffering and distraction. He lived as though the world were exactly what his philosophy claimed it was, a realm of suffering and conflict, with peace available only in brief moments of withdrawal. Love is a cosmic scam, and you're the victim. Romantic love is universally celebrated as humanity's highest emotion, the source of meaning and transcendence. Poets immortalize it. Novelists structure entire plots around it. People organize their lives in pursuit of it. Schopenhauer looked at this cultural consensus and called it mass delusion. Love is not what people think it is. It is a biological trap, nature's mechanism for ensuring reproduction, disguised as personal fulfillment. The argument begins with an observation. Sexual attraction is extraordinarily powerful. People risk their marriages, careers, reputations, and sanity for it. They become obsessed with specific individuals, unable to think of anything else, convinced that possessing this particular person is essential to their happiness. This intensity seems disproportionate to any rational benefit. If you analyze what sexual fulfillment actually provides, it does not justify the disruption it causes, yet people cannot resist it. Why? Schopenhauer's answer: you are not acting in your own interest. You are acting in the interest of the species. Sexual desire is not about your happiness, but about creating the next generation. Nature needs you to reproduce, but it cannot simply order you to do so. You would not obey. Instead, it makes you want to reproduce by creating intense feelings that make reproduction seem like personal fulfillment. You think you desire a person. Actually, you desire to create a child, but you do not know this. The person you fall in love with is not chosen arbitrarily. Sexual attraction follows patterns that serve reproductive success. Men are typically attracted to young women with features indicating fertility: clear skin, symmetrical features, healthy proportions. Women are typically attracted to men displaying resources, status, and physical strength. These preferences feel personal and mysterious. In reality, you are responding to genetic programming designed to produce viable offspring. Schopenhauer went further. The specific person you fall in love with is determined by unconscious calculation about what traits your children would have. If you have a weak constitution, you will be attracted to someone robust. If you are short, you may be attracted to someone tall. If you are impulsive, you may be attracted to someone calm. This is not conscious deliberation. It is nature working through you to balance traits and offspring. You experience this as romantic destiny. It is genetic calculation. He called this the genius of the species. There is an intelligence operating in sexual attraction, but it is not your intelligence. It is accumulated evolutionary wisdom, working to create offspring who will survive and reproduce in turn. This genius operates through you but cares nothing for you. It will make you fall in love with someone completely unsuitable for an actual relationship, someone who will make you miserable if that person would produce genetically advantageous children. This explains the frequent mismatch between sexual attraction and compatibility. People are often most intensely attracted to precisely the wrong person, someone with incompatible values, goals, or temperaments. They pursue these relationships despite obvious problems, convinced that love will overcome obstacles. It rarely does. The attraction fades after reproduction occurs, or after enough time passes that reproduction is unlikely. Then people find themselves trapped with someone they would not have chosen if they had been thinking rationally. The pattern is clearest in cases of intense, obsessive love. When someone becomes completely fixated on another person, unable to function normally, the rational mind recognizes this as pathological. But the person experiencing it feels it as truth, as the most real and important thing in their life. Schopenhauer explained this as the will to live overwhelming individual consciousness. The species-level drive for reproduction temporarily takes over, pushing aside all other concerns. He analyzed the phases of romantic love as stages of a biological program. Initial attraction is intense and irrational. You cannot explain why this person and not another. This is nature ensuring you focus on a genetically suitable mate. Courtship involves obsessive thinking, idealization, and willingness to sacrifice anything. This is nature ensuring you overcome obstacles to reproduction. Consummation brings temporary satisfaction, but also marks the beginning of attraction's decline. Nature no longer needs to maintain the illusion once reproduction has occurred or is likely. Marriage, in Schopenhauer's analysis, is the institutionalization of this trap. Society recognizes that sexual attraction is temporary and that people would abandon each other once intensity fades. So society creates legal and social structures to keep couples together long enough to raise children. Marriage is not about love, it is about ensuring offspring survive to maturity. The personal happiness of the couple is irrelevant to this goal, which is why so many marriages become prisons of mutual resentment. He was particularly critical of romantic ideology, the cultural narratives that frame love as spiritual union or personal completion. These stories are lies nature tells to make people cooperate with its agenda. You are told that finding your soulmate will bring lasting happiness. This is false. The happiness lasts until nature has achieved its goal. Then you are left with another human being who has their own needs and flaws, none of which were apparent when you were in love's temporary insanity. The suffering caused by love is immense. People die of heartbreak, lose their minds from jealousy, ruin their lives over sexual obsession. Yet people continue to pursue love as if it were salvation. Schopenhauer saw this as perhaps the clearest evidence of the will's power. Even when people have experienced love's aftermath, the fading of attraction, the reality of incompatibility, the burden of commitment, they still desire it again. The will never learns because it does not care about individual suffering. He compared sexual love to a conspiracy where nature is the conspirator and humans are the dupes. You think you are acting freely, pursuing your own happiness. Actually, you are following a script written by evolutionary pressures over millions of years. The script requires your suffering to work. If love were genuinely fulfilling, people would be content with one relationship and would not continue creating new generations. Love must fail at the individual level to succeed at the species level. This analysis extended to beauty. Physical beauty is not objective or mysterious. It is the perception of traits that correlate with reproductive success. A beautiful face indicates health and fertility. Beautiful proportions indicate strength and genetic quality. When you find someone beautiful, you are not perceiving an aesthetic truth. You are experiencing a biological response designed to direct you toward genetically suitable mates. Schopenhauer acknowledged that love sometimes produces genuine companionship, mutual support, and lasting affection. But he insisted these are byproducts, not the main purpose. Nature does not care whether you are happy together as long as you reproduce. If happiness emerges, that is accidental, and these positive outcomes are rare. Most relationships fail or become merely tolerable. The suffering vastly outweighs the satisfaction. He recommended awareness as the only partial defense. If you understand that your attraction is not what it seems, you can maintain some distance from it. You will still feel desire. You cannot eliminate that while alive. But you can recognize it as an imposition rather than truth. You can choose whether to act on attraction based on rational assessment of likely outcomes rather than on intensity of feeling. This will not prevent all mistakes, but it reduces catastrophic ones. He also argued for the value of sublimation. Sexual energy can be redirected into creative or intellectual work. This is not complete escape, the underlying drive remains, but it transforms raw sexual urge into something less destructive. Many great artists and thinkers were celibate or minimized sexual activity, not because they lacked desire, but because they recognized that indulging it would consume energy needed for higher pursuits. His own life reflected these principles. He never married, never committed to a long-term relationship, and treated sex as a biological necessity to be satisfied with minimal emotional involvement. He visited prostitutes, which he considered honest, a straightforward transaction without the pretense of love. He had affairs, but ended them when women wanted commitment. He protected his independence above all else, viewing romantic attachment as the most dangerous form of will submission. Critics accused him of bitterness, suggesting his views stemmed from personal failure. There is some truth to this. His relationship with his mother was toxic, his attempts at romance apparently unsatisfying, and his temperament unsuited to intimacy. But personal motivation does not automatically invalidate an argument. He provided a coherent explanation for phenomena that romantic ideology cannot explain. Why attraction is so powerful yet so often leads to misery. Why people repeatedly make the same mistakes. Why sexual desire persists even when it causes suffering. Modern biology has largely confirmed Schopenhauer's basic insight. Evolutionary psychology demonstrates that mate preferences are shaped by reproductive strategy.
The intensity of romantic love correlates with neurochemical processes that evolve to facilitate pair bonding long enough for offspring to survive. The idealization phase serves to overcome rational objections. The eventual fading of passion is documented and predictable. Nature does manipulate us into reproducing, exactly as Schopenhauer claimed.
This does not mean love is worthless or should be avoided entirely. It means approaching love with clear understanding of what it is and is not. It is not a path to transcendence or completion. It is not proof that you have found your soulmate or that the universe cares about your happiness. It is a biological phenomenon that can sometimes be channeled into something valuable, but more often leads to suffering when misunderstood.
Schopenhauer's analysis of love is perhaps his most accessible insight. Everyone has experienced attraction's irrationality, the mismatch between desire and compatibility, the gap between romantic promise and mundane reality. His explanation cuts through centuries of idealization to reveal the mechanism underneath. Whether this revelation brings liberation or despair depends on the individual, but it is difficult, once understood, to experience romantic love with the same innocence again.
20 Years of Silence from Failure to Fame. In December 1818, The World as Will and Representation was published. Schopenhauer was 30 years old. The book represented 6 years of intensive work and contained what he believed was the solution to the fundamental riddle of existence. He was certain he had written one of the most important philosophical works in human history. He sent copies to prominent thinkers and waited for recognition he knew he deserved. Nothing happened. A few reviews appeared in obscure journals. They were brief, dismissive, or confused. Most publications ignored the book entirely. Sales were non-existent. His publisher, Friedrich Arnold Brockhaus, reported that the book sat unsold in warehouses. After several years, Brockhaus admitted that most copies had been pulped as waste paper to recover some value from the failed investment. The book Schopenhauer expected to revolutionize philosophy had disappeared without a trace. His reaction mixed rage, bitterness, and stubborn defiance. He blamed everyone except himself. The problem was not his work. That was obviously brilliant. The problem was the corruption of contemporary philosophy, the stupidity of the reading public, and the conspiracy of mediocre academics to suppress genuine talent. He convinced himself that history would vindicate him. Future generations would recognize his genius even if his own generation could not. The intellectual climate worked against him. German philosophy in the 1820s was dominated by Hegel. Hegel taught that reality is fundamentally rational, that history progresses toward greater freedom, and that conflict and suffering are necessary stages in spirit's development. His philosophy was systematic, optimistic, and compatible with Christian theology and Prussian politics. It dominated German universities. Schopenhauer's philosophy was the opposite. Reality is fundamentally irrational. History progresses toward nothing. Suffering is not a stage to be overcome, but the permanent condition of existence. His work was pessimistic, atheistic, and politically indifferent. It found no institutional support. Universities wanted professors who would teach Hegelian idealism. Publishers wanted books that would sell to educated readers seeking uplift. Schopenhauer offered neither. He attempted an academic career anyway. In 1820, he applied to become a lecturer at the University of Berlin, where Hegel held the most prestigious chair. The university accepted him as a Privatdozent, a position that paid nothing but allowed him to charge students for lectures. He would have to attract an audience to earn anything. He made a catastrophic decision. He scheduled his lectures at exactly the same time as Hegel's. This was either supreme confidence or spectacular foolishness, probably both. He believed students would abandon Hegel once they heard a real philosopher. He was wrong. Students crowded Hegel's lectures. Schopenhauer's classroom was nearly empty. On some days, no one came at all. After one semester, he gave up. He never taught again. The 1820s and 1830s were his wilderness years. He published essays and supplements, but they attracted no attention. He translated texts, wrote on specialized topics, entered essay competitions. One competition asked for essays on the freedom of the human will. Schopenhauer submitted an essay arguing free will is an illusion. He won the prize, not because the judges agreed, but because his was the only submission. He attempted to publish a second work through a different publisher, hoping a fresh start might bring better results. The publisher accepted it, but printed a tiny run. Sales were even worse. Schopenhauer suspected sabotage, convinced that Hegelian academics were actively suppressing his work. There is no evidence this was true. The simpler explanation is that almost no one was interested. His financial situation was secure, which made his intellectual obscurity more bearable but also more bitter. He had inherited substantial wealth and invested it conservatively. He could live comfortably without working. This was fortunate because his books earned almost nothing, but financial security did not compensate for lack of recognition. He had not written for money. He had written for immortality, for acknowledgement that he had grasped fundamental truths. That acknowledgement never came. He watched lesser minds achieve fame and positions he believed should be his. Hegel died in 1831, but his influence continued through his students. They occupied philosophy chairs across Germany, published prolifically, and shaped intellectual discourse. Schopenhauer lived alone in Frankfurt, unknown and unread. His name appeared in no philosophical encyclopedias, no academic histories, no lists of important thinkers. The isolation affected him. His writing grew increasingly bitter. He filled notebooks with denunciations of other philosophers, particularly Hegel, whom he called a charlatan and a murderer of truth. He developed elaborate theories about why mediocrities succeed while geniuses are ignored. He became paranoid, interpreting every slight as conspiracy. His personality, never warm, hardened into misanthropy, yet he continued working. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these silent decades. He had every reason to give up. No one read his work, no one discussed it, no one cared. He could have abandoned philosophy and lived pleasantly on his inherited wealth. Instead, he kept writing. He produced essays on ethics, aesthetics, psychology, and religion. He expanded his main work, preparing a second edition, though the first had barely sold. He maintained absolute confidence that he was right and the world was wrong. This confidence was not entirely delusional. He had created a genuinely original philosophical system. It explained phenomena other philosophies could not explain. It was internally consistent and supported by observation. The problem was not quality, but fit. His philosophy did not match what his culture wanted. It offered no comfort, no hope, no endorsement of progress or Christian morality. It was too dark for popular success and too hostile to academic trends for institutional acceptance. In the 1840s, small signs of change appeared. A few younger philosophers discovered his work and recognized its value. They wrote letters praising his insights. Some cited his work in their publications. These were isolated incidents, but they broke the absolute silence. Schopenhauer collected these acknowledgments carefully, evidence that he was not entirely forgotten. The breakthrough came in 1851 with Parerga and Paralipomena, a 2-volume collection of essays. Unlike his earlier systematic works, this was accessible. The essays were shorter, more varied, and written in clearer style. One essay offered practical advice for living well. Another discussed talent and genius. Others covered reading, thinking, and writing. The book found an audience. It was not an immediate bestseller, but it sold steadily. Reviewers praised it. Educated readers bought it. Slowly, Schopenhauer's name began to circulate beyond tiny philosophical circles. People who read the essays became curious about his systematic philosophy. Sales of The World as Will and Representation, which had sat dormant for 30 years, began to increase. By the mid-1850s, Schopenhauer was experiencing something approaching fame. Journals published articles about his philosophy. Students sought him out. Visitors came to Frankfurt hoping to meet him. Universities that had ignored him now acknowledged his contributions. He was not yet mainstream, but he was no longer invisible. He was 65 years old. He had waited more than 3 decades for this recognition. The bitterness of those decades shaped his response. He enjoyed the attention immensely, but never forgave those who had ignored him. He remained convinced that his initial reception had been an injustice. He collected every review, every mention of his name, organizing them in scrapbooks. He read them repeatedly, savoring evidence that he had been right all along. Richard Wagner visited him in 1854, declaring himself a disciple. Schopenhauer was pleased but skeptical. He enjoyed opera but considered Wagner's theoretical writings pretentious. Still, having a major cultural figure acknowledge his influence was gratifying. Other artists and intellectuals followed. Schopenhauer found himself, improbably, at the center of a small movement. He used his late fame strategically. He prepared expanded editions of his works, adding prefaces that attacked critics and vindicated his long wait. He wrote new essays addressing questions readers had raised. He positioned himself as the philosopher who had been right when everyone else was wrong, who had endured decades of neglect without compromising his vision. His death in 1860 came just as his influence was expanding. He did not live to see how thoroughly his ideas would penetrate European culture over the following decades. Nietzsche would build on and against his work. Freud would acknowledge him as a predecessor. Wagner's operas would embody his aesthetics. His influence would extend far beyond academic philosophy into literature, psychology, and popular culture. The 20 years of silence became a central part of his legend. proof that he had been ahead of his time, that genuine originality is initially rejected, that patience and conviction eventually triumph. This narrative inspired later thinkers who faced their own obscurity. It also served as a warning about institutional philosophy's limitations. Whether the wait was worth it is unanswerable. Schopenhauer gained recognition, but only at the end when it could no longer change his trajectory. The bitter, isolated man who emerged from the silent decades was not transformed by late fame. He enjoyed it, but it did not heal the wounds those decades had inflicted. Perhaps this too confirmed his philosophy. Satisfaction, when it finally arrives, is never as fulfilling as anticipated, and much of what seems worth pursuing turns out to be empty once achieved. The Hedgehog's Dilemma. Schopenhauer told a simple story that captured something fundamental about human relationships. A group of hedgehogs huddle together for warmth on a cold winter day. As they move closer, their spines prick each other, causing pain. They pull apart to escape the discomfort, but then they become cold again, so they move closer once more, only to be pricked again. They oscillate back and forth, trying to find the optimal distance, close enough for warmth but far enough to avoid injury. They never quite succeed. This is the hedgehog's dilemma, and it describes the permanent predicament of human intimacy. We need other people. Complete isolation is cold and unbearable for most humans. We crave connection, understanding, companionship, so we move toward others, seeking closeness. But as we get closer, problems emerge. Our individual differences, needs, and boundaries begin to conflict. We irritate each other, disappoint each other, hurt each other. The very closeness we sought becomes painful. The natural response is to pull away, to create distance and protect ourselves. This brings relief from the immediate friction, but it also brings loneliness. The coldness returns. So we try again, moving closer, hoping this time will be different. It rarely is. The pattern repeats endlessly. We are caught between two forms of suffering, the pain of closeness and the pain of distance. Schopenhauer believed this dilemma had no perfect solution. You cannot achieve complete intimacy without conflict because human beings are separate individuals with their own will, desires, and needs. When two wills interact closely, they inevitably clash. Your needs conflict with mine. Your preferences annoy me. Your expectations burden me. My independence threatens you. My selfishness hurts you. There is no way to merge two separate beings into perfect harmony. But you also cannot achieve complete independence without loneliness. Humans are social animals. We evolved in groups and carry deep needs for connection. Total isolation leads to psychological decay. People need touch, conversation, shared experience. Without these, we deteriorate. The hermit achieves freedom from conflict, but pays with emptiness. The hedgehog's dilemma explains why relationships are so difficult and why they follow predictable patterns. The beginning of a relationship is often characterized by intense closeness. People want to spend all their time together, share everything, merge their lives. This feels wonderful temporarily because the warmth of connection is strong and the pricks of conflict have not yet become evident. Everything is possibility and promise, but as time passes and real intimacy develops, the conflicts emerge. You discover that the other person is not who you imagined. They have annoying habits, different values, needs that clash with yours. The fantasy of perfect union gives way to the reality of two separate, flawed human beings trying to coexist. The pricks become painful, arguments happen, resentments build. The relationship that once felt like salvation now feels like a burden. This is when people typically pull back. They create emotional distance, spend less time together, withhold parts of themselves. This reduces the immediate conflict and provides relief. But it also reduces the warmth. The relationship becomes cooler, more formal, more lonely. People find themselves living parallel lives, technically together, but not really connected. This brings its own suffering. Some relationships end at this point. People decide the pain of closeness outweighs the benefit and separate entirely. Others oscillate indefinitely, moving between closeness and distance, never finding equilibrium. A few, very few, find a middle distance that minimizes both forms of suffering, though even these relationships involve compromise and ongoing negotiation. Schopenhauer saw this pattern not just in romantic relationships, but in all human connections. Friendships face the same dilemma. Too much closeness leads to irritation and conflict. Too much distance leads to the friendship fading. Parent-child relationships struggle with the same problem. Coworkers navigate it daily. Even brief social interactions involve managing the tension between engagement and boundary. The dilemma is rooted in a deeper problem, the fundamental separation between individuals. Each person is driven by their own will, pursuing their own interests. When interests align, cooperation is easy, but interests rarely align completely. Your will and mine exist in different bodies, with different histories, different needs. We can never fully understand each other or fully share each other's experience. There is always a gap, an irreducible separateness. This separateness is both the source of the problem and the reason no perfect solution exists. If we were truly one being, there would be no conflict but also no relationship. Relationship exists precisely because we are separate, but separation guarantees conflict. You cannot have the benefits of relationship without the costs that come from two distinct wills interacting. Schopenhauer did not offer a solution to the hedgehog's dilemma because he believed none existed. He offered only awareness. If you understand that the dilemma is inherent in human connection, not a personal failing or a problem with your specific relationships, you can manage it more skillfully. You can recognize that the oscillation between closeness and distance is normal, not a sign that something is wrong. You can also adjust your expectations. Most people enter relationships expecting perfect harmony and are disappointed when conflict arises. If you understand that conflict is inevitable, you can be more patient with it. The goal is not to eliminate conflict, but to find a manageable level of it, a distance that provides enough warmth without too many. He suggested that the best relationships are those where both parties understand and accept the dilemma. They do not demand perfect closeness or perfect understanding. They recognize that the other person is separate, with their own will and needs, and that this separation will necessarily create friction. They negotiate boundaries explicitly rather than assuming the other person should know what they want. They accept that loneliness and conflict are both part of the human condition and cannot be entirely eliminated. Schopenhauer's own life reflected his understanding of the dilemma. He chose distance. He lived alone, maintained no close friendships, and avoided long-term romantic commitments. He accepted loneliness as the price of avoiding the conflicts that come with closeness. He found warmth in intellectual work, art, and his dogs rather than in human relationships. This was not a happy solution, but it was a stable one. He did not oscillate. He stayed on the cold side of the dilemma. Most people cannot or will not make this choice. They need more human warmth than Schopenhauer did. For them, the dilemma remains active. They must navigate it daily, finding temporary balances that inevitably shift. A relationship that feels too close one day may feel too distant the next. Needs change, circumstances change, and the optimal distance changes with them. The hedgehog's dilemma also explains why advice about relationships is often contradictory and unhelpful. Some experts tell you to prioritize independence and boundaries. Others tell you to open up and be vulnerable. Some say give your partner space. Others say spend more time together. All this advice addresses different sides of the dilemma. The person who is too close needs more space. The person who is too distant needs more closeness. But there is no universal solution because the dilemma itself is universal. Modern psychology has largely confirmed Schopenhauer's insight, though it uses different language. Attachment theory describes how people navigate closeness and distance in relationships. Some people are anxiously attached, constantly seeking closeness and fearing abandonment. Others are avoidantly attached, maintaining distance and fearing engulfment. Both patterns reflect the hedgehog's dilemma. The anxiously attached focus on the coldness of distance. The avoidantly attached focus on the pricks of closeness. Both are responding to real aspects of the same underlying problem. The dilemma extends beyond personal relationships into social and political life. Communities face the same tension. Too much collective closeness creates oppressive conformity and loss of individual freedom. Too much individual independence creates social fragmentation and loss of mutual support. Healthy societies, like healthy relationships, must find some middle ground, though what that ground looks like varies by culture and context. Schopenhauer's hedgehog story is simple but profound. It captures in a single image something that most people sense but struggle to articulate, that human connection is inherently problematic, that we are caught between two forms of suffering with no perfect escape. The story does not offer hope for a solution, which may be why it is less popular than more optimistic accounts of human relationships, but it offers something perhaps more valuable, accurate understanding of the situation we are in. If you accept the hedgehog's dilemma, you can stop searching for the relationship that will finally solve it. No such relationship exists. Every connection will involve the same basic problem. You can instead focus on finding relationships where the balance feels manageable, where the warmth is worth the pricks, and where both parties understand they are navigating an inherent difficulty rather than a personal failure. This is not inspiring, but it is realistic. And for Schopenhauer, realism was always more important than inspiration. He believed that accurate understanding of our situation, however uncomfortable, was the only foundation for wise living. The hedgehog's dilemma shows us that foundation. We are separate beings with conflicting needs, and closeness will always involve pain. Knowing this does not eliminate the pain, but it prevents us from adding unnecessary suffering by expecting what cannot be. Buddha meets Kant, how East and West collided in his mind. Schopenhauer was the first major Western philosopher to seriously engage with Eastern thought. Before him, European philosophers occasionally mentioned Indian or Chinese ideas, usually dismissively, as curiosities from exotic cultures. Schopenhauer did something different. He studied Eastern philosophy carefully, found deep resonances with his own thinking, and integrated Eastern concepts into his system. He believed that Indian philosophy had arrived at truths that Western philosophy was only beginning to discover. His encounter with Eastern thought came through the Upanishads, ancient Hindu philosophical texts. In 1814, a friend showed him a Latin translation made from a Persian version of the Sanskrit originals. The translation was indirect and imperfect, but Schopenhauer was immediately struck by what he read. He found ideas that seemed to confirm his own developing philosophy, that the world of individual things is illusory, that beneath apparent multiplicity lies a unified reality, that existence is characterized by suffering, and that liberation comes through seeing through illusion. He also encountered Buddhist thought, though less directly. Buddhist texts were not widely available in Europe during his lifetime, but he learned about Buddhist ideas through secondary sources and through the growing body of scholarship on Asian religions. He recognized in Buddhism a philosophy that, like his own, identified desire as the root of suffering and prescribed the cessation of desire as the path to liberation. The parallels between Schopenhauer's philosophy and Eastern thought are striking. Both traditions teach that the world as it appears to us is not ultimate reality. Hindu philosophy speaks of Maya, the veil of illusion that makes us see multiplicity where there is actually unity. Schopenhauer spoke of the phenomenal world of space, time, and causality, which conceals the underlying unity of the will. Both traditions suggest that ordinary perception is fundamentally mistaken. Both traditions also teach that suffering is intrinsic to existence. Buddhism's first noble truth states that life is characterized by dukkha, often translated as suffering, but meaning something closer to unsatisfactoriness or discontent. Schopenhauer's philosophy begins with essentially the same claim, that existence necessarily involves suffering because desire necessarily involves lack. Both saw suffering not as an accidental feature of poorly arranged lives, but as built into the structure of existence itself. Both traditions identify desire or craving as the root cause of suffering. Buddhism teaches that tanha, thirst or craving, binds us to the cycle of rebirth and perpetuates suffering. Schopenhauer taught that the will to live, which manifests as endless desire, is the source of all pain. Both saw that as long as we want things, we will suffer, because wanting itself is a state of deficiency. Both traditions prescribe a similar solution, the cessation of desire. Buddhism speaks of nirvana, the extinguishing of craving and the end of suffering. Schopenhauer spoke of the denial of the will to live, a state where desire falls silent and peace becomes possible. Both saw this not as death, but as a transformation of consciousness, a way of being in the world without being driven by it. Both traditions value compassion. Buddhist ethics centers on karuna, compassion for all sentient beings who suffer. Schopenhauer built his ethics on Mitleid, literally suffering with, the recognition that all beings share the same underlying nature and therefore the same suffering. Both saw moral behavior as flowing from this recognition of shared identity rather than from rules or divine commands. These parallels were not coincidental. Schopenhauer believed he and the Eastern philosophers had independently discovered the same truths because they had looked clearly at reality without the distorting influence of Judeo-Christian assumptions. Western philosophy and religion had been shaped by the belief in a personal God, the immortality of the individual soul, and the fundamental goodness of creation. These beliefs, Schopenhauer thought, prevented Western thinkers from seeing things as they are. Eastern philosophy developed without these assumptions. It was willing to confront the possibility that existence is suffering, that the individual self is an illusion, and that the world was not created for human benefit. This allowed Eastern philosophers to see more clearly. Schopenhauer believed he had achieved the same clarity in the West by studying Kant, who had shown that our knowledge is limited to appearances, not things as they are in themselves. Kant was Schopenhauer's other great influence, and his system can be understood as an attempt to synthesize Kant and the Upanishads. From Kant, Schopenhauer took the distinction between phenomena and noumena, between the world as it appears to us through the structures of space, time, and causality, and the world as it is in itself.
Kant argued we can never know the thing in itself. Schopenhauer agreed that we cannot know it through perception or reason, but claimed we have direct access to it through our own inner experience. The thing in itself is the will, and we experience it directly as our own drive and desire. From Eastern philosophy, Schopenhauer took the insight that the multiplicity of individual things is illusory, that all beings share a common nature, and that liberation comes through seeing through the illusion of individuality. He combined this with Kant's epistemology to create a system that was both Western in its rigor and Eastern in its conclusions. Schopenhauer explicitly acknowledged these influences. He kept a bust of Kant in his study and a statue of the Buddha. He wrote that the Upanishads had been the consolation of his life and would be the consolation of his death. He called Buddhism the most profound of all religions. He saw himself as part of a tradition that spanned continents and millennia, a tradition of clear-eyed thinkers who refused to accept comforting illusions about existence. His synthesis was not without problems. He sometimes misunderstood Eastern ideas, filtered them through Western categories, or simplified them to fit his system. He had limited access to original texts and relied heavily on translations and secondary sources. Some scholars argue that his interpretation of Buddhism and Hinduism was more projection than accurate understanding. But despite these limitations, Schopenhauer's engagement with Eastern thought was groundbreaking. He took Asian philosophy seriously as philosophy, not as exotic religion or primitive wisdom. He showed that Western and Eastern thinkers could arrive at similar conclusions through different paths. He opened the door for later philosophers and scholars to engage with Eastern thought more deeply. His influence on the Western reception of Eastern philosophy was significant. Later in the 19th century, interest in Buddhism and Hinduism grew in Europe and America. Schopenhauer's work was one factor in this development. He made Eastern ideas respectable among intellectuals. He showed that these were sophisticated philosophical systems worthy of serious study, not merely religious superstitions. His synthesis also raised an important question. Are the similarities between his philosophy and Eastern thought evidence of universal truth, or are they evidence that similar cultural conditions produce similar ideas? Schopenhauer believed the former. He thought the parallels proved that he and the Eastern philosophers had discovered objective truths about reality. Skeptics might argue that both traditions developed in cultures that emphasized renunciation and saw worldly life as problematic, and that this shared orientation produced similar philosophies. Regardless of how one answers this question, Schopenhauer's project of bringing together Kant and Buddha was philosophically fruitful. It showed that insights from different traditions could be combined into a coherent system. It demonstrated that Eastern and Western philosophy are not fundamentally incompatible, but address many of the same problems with overlapping solutions. His work also highlighted the limits of purely Western philosophy. Thinkers working within the Judeo-Christian framework struggled to explain suffering, to account for the prevalence of evil, to make sense of a world that does not seem designed for human flourishing. They twisted themselves into increasingly complex theodicies, trying to reconcile belief in a good God with the reality of suffering. Eastern philosophy, starting from different premises, had a more straightforward explanation. Existence is suffering because that is its nature, not because something went wrong. Schopenhauer believed that Western philosophy would eventually converge with Eastern insights as it freed itself from theological assumptions. He saw himself as pioneering this convergence. Whether he was right about the direction of Western thought is debatable. Philosophy did not simply adopt his synthesis, but his work opened possibilities that others would explore. Nietzsche, though he rejected much of Schopenhauer's system, continued the engagement with Eastern thought. Later philosophers and psychologists, from Carl Jung to Alan Watts, would build on Schopenhauer's foundation, bringing Eastern ideas more fully into Western discourse. The meeting of Buddha and Kant in Schopenhauer's philosophy represents something larger: the possibility of genuine dialogue between different intellectual traditions, the recognition that wisdom can emerge from multiple sources, and the idea that truth, if it exists, should be accessible through different paths. This was radical in the 19th century and remains important today. Schopenhauer, for all his faults, understood that provincial thinking limits understanding, and that the great questions about existence transcend cultural boundaries. Retriem dals he, the illusion of free will, you're not in control. Free will is one of humanity's most cherished beliefs. People assume they are the authors of their actions, that they genuinely choose what they do, that they could have done otherwise if they had wanted to. This belief is central to moral responsibility, legal systems, and personal identity. Without it, punishment seems unjust, praise seems meaningless, and life seems like a mechanical process in which we are merely passengers. Schopenhauer examined this belief carefully and concluded it was an illusion.
His argument begins with a simple distinction between two kinds of freedom. The first is freedom to do what you want. This kind of freedom is real and uncontroversial. If nothing external prevents you from acting on your desires, you are free in this sense. You want to raise your arm, and you can raise it. You want to walk out the door, and no one stops you. This is freedom of action, and everyone experiences it daily. The second kind is freedom to want what you want. This is freedom of will, and this is what Schopenhauer denied. You do not choose your desires. They arise in you unbidden, driven by factors beyond your control. You find yourself wanting coffee, wanting companionship, wanting recognition, wanting rest. You do not decide to want these things. You simply discover that you want them. The wants appear, and then you act on them or do not, depending on circumstances. Consider a simple decision. You are sitting in a room, and you decide to stand up and walk to the window. This feels like a free choice. No one forced you. No external constraint prevented alternatives. You could have stayed seated. But Schopenhauer asks, why did you want to walk to the window at that particular moment? If you examine the question honestly, you will find that the desire arose from somewhere deeper than conscious choice. Perhaps you were bored and wanted stimulation. Perhaps you heard a noise outside and felt curious. Perhaps you felt restless and needed movement. Whatever the cause, the desire to walk to the window came to you. You did not create it through an act of pure will. It emerged from your character, your mood, your circumstances, your biological state, your history. All of these factors operated beneath the level of conscious control. Schopenhauer distinguished between motives and causes. In the physical world, causes produce effects mechanically. A ball strikes another ball, and the second ball moves. In the human world, motives produce actions. You have a motive, hunger, ambition, fear, and you act. But the relationship between motive and action is just as determined as the relationship between physical causes and effects. Given your character and the motive, the action follows necessarily. The crucial point is that you did not choose your character. Your character is the product of factors you had no control over: your genetic inheritance, your early childhood experiences, your culture, your education, the countless influences that shaped you before you were capable of reflecting on them. By the time you are old enough to think about who you are, your character is already formed, and your character determines how you respond to motives. Two people in the same situation will act differently because they have different characters. One person sees an opportunity to cheat and feels tempted. Another sees the same opportunity and feels disgusted. The difference lies in their characters, not in their free choices. Neither person chose to be the kind of person who would be tempted or disgusted. They discovered this about themselves through experience. Schopenhauer used a formula to express this. A person can do what they want, but they cannot want what they want. You have freedom to act on your desires, but you do not have freedom to choose which desires you have. Your desires are determined by your character and your circumstances. Your actions follow from your desires. Therefore, your actions, though they feel free, are determined. This does not mean your actions are predictable with certainty. Human psychology is complex, and we cannot always know what motives will dominate in a given situation. But unpredictability is not the same as freedom. A roulette wheel is unpredictable, but not free. It operates according to physical laws, even if we cannot calculate the outcome in advance. Similarly, human actions follow from character and motive, even when we cannot predict exactly what someone will do. The feeling of freedom, according to Schopenhauer, is a persistent illusion. When you act, you are aware of what you are doing, but not of all the factors that led to the action. You see the final step, the conscious decision, but not the long chain of causes that produced that decision. This creates the impression that the decision came from nowhere, that you created it freely. But this impression reflects ignorance, not genuine freedom. He compared it to water flowing downhill. If the water were conscious, it might feel that it was freely choosing to flow in a particular direction. It would be aware of its movement, but not of gravity, the slope of the land, and the obstacles that channeled it. It would mistake the absence of felt constraint for positive freedom. Humans make the same mistake. We are aware of our actions, but not of the deep causes that determine them, so we imagine we are free. This analysis has profound implications for moral responsibility. If people do not genuinely choose their actions, how can they be held responsible for them? How can punishment be justified? Schopenhauer acknowledged this problem, but did not think it undermined morality entirely. People are responsible in the sense that their actions flow from their characters. When we punish someone, we are not punishing a free choice. We are responding to a character that produces harmful actions. Punishment serves as a motive that might influence future behavior, and it protects society from dangerous individuals. But Schopenhauer insisted this should change how we think about punishment. We should not punish out of moral outrage or righteous indignation, as if the person could easily have chosen otherwise. We should punish pragmatically when it serves a useful purpose and without the vindictiveness that comes from believing in free will. Criminals are products of factors they did not control. They deserve pity more than hatred, though they may still need to be restrained. His view also has implications for how we judge ourselves. Most people carry guilt about past actions, tormenting themselves with thoughts of what they should have done differently. Schopenhauer suggested this is largely pointless. You acted according to your character and the motives present at the time. Given who you were and what you knew, you could not have acted otherwise. Guilt is useful only if it modifies future behavior. Otherwise, it is unnecessary suffering added to the suffering already inherent in existence. The denial of free will also undermines certain forms of pride and self-congratulation. If you succeed, it is because of talents and opportunities you did not choose. If you make good decisions, it is because you have the kind of character that makes good decisions, and you did not choose that character. This does not mean success is meaningless, but it should be recognized as fortunate rather than as evidence of superior free choice. Critics of Schopenhauer's position argue that it eliminates human agency and makes life meaningless. If we are not free, what is the point of deliberation, effort, or moral striving? Schopenhauer's response was that deliberation and effort are themselves determined processes. You deliberate because that is what a rational being does when faced with complex choices. The fact that your deliberation is determined does not make it useless. It is part of the causal chain that leads to action. Moreover, understanding that you are not free does not change what you will do. You will still act according to your character and motives, but it can change how you feel about what you do. You may become less arrogant about successes, less harsh in judging yourself and others, more aware that everyone is struggling with drives they did not choose. This shift in attitude can reduce suffering, even if it does not change behavior. Modern neuroscience has provided evidence that supports Schopenhauer's position, though it arrives at similar conclusions through different methods. Brain imaging studies show that neural activity associated with a decision begins before the person becomes consciously aware of having made the decision. This suggests that conscious choice is not the origin of action, but rather a late stage in a process that began unconsciously. The feeling of deciding comes after the brain has already initiated the action. This does not prove Schopenhauer was right about everything, but it confirms his central insight. The feeling of free will does not correspond to the actual mechanics of decision-making. What we experience as conscious choice is the tip of a much larger process, most of which operates beneath awareness. We are not the authors of our actions in the way we intuitively believe. Schopenhauer's denial of free will was not meant to be depressing, though many people find it so. He saw it as liberating in certain ways. If you recognize that you and everyone else are driven by forces beyond control, you can stop wasting energy on moral indignation, on demands that people should be different than they are, on guilt about your own nature. You can accept reality as it is and work within that reality rather than against it. The absence of free will does not eliminate all agency or make effort pointless. You still experience desires and act on them. You still deliberate and make decisions. The process feels the same. What changes is the metaphysical interpretation. You are not a free agent standing outside the causal order, making uncaused choices. You are part of the causal order, a node in the network through which forces flow. Your actions are genuine expressions of your character, but your character itself is not freely chosen. This view places Schopenhauer in a long philosophical tradition that includes Spinoza and anticipates modern determinism. It also connects to his broader metaphysics. If the will is the thing in itself, and if individual humans are manifestations of this single will, then human actions are ultimately expressions of the will operating through particular forms. The individual person is not truly separate from the will, and therefore cannot stand apart from it to freely choose. Choice is always the will choosing, and the will operates according to its nature, not according to conscious deliberation. Understanding that you lack free will does not solve the problem of existence, but it removes one layer of unnecessary suffering. You stop blaming yourself for being what you are. You stop demanding that others be different from what they are. You see everyone, including yourself, as temporary manifestations of blind forces, struggling with desires they did not choose, trying to find moments of peace in a fundamentally difficult existence. This recognition does not make life easy, but it makes it somewhat more bearable through acceptance of what cannot be changed. Schopenhauer versus Hegel, the rivalry that split German philosophy. In the history of philosophy, few rivalries were as bitter and consequential as the conflict between Arthur Schopenhauer and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. They represented opposite poles of 19th century German thought. Hegel was the celebrated professor, the systematic optimist, the philosopher of historical progress. Schopenhauer was the outsider, the pessimist, the prophet of suffering and meaninglessness. Their conflict was not merely personal, though it was intensely personal. It was a battle over the fundamental nature of reality and the future direction of Western philosophy. Hegel was born in 1770, 18 years before Schopenhauer. By the time Schopenhauer arrived in Berlin in 1811 to study philosophy, Hegel had already established himself as a major thinker. His Phenomenology of Spirit, published in 1807, was recognized as a significant work, though its difficulty made it accessible only to specialists. Hegel taught that reality is fundamentally rational, that history is the process by which spirit comes to know itself, and that apparent contradictions are resolved in higher syntheses. His philosophy was complex, systematic, and optimistic about human progress. Schopenhauer attended Hegel's lectures and was appalled. He found them pompous, obscure, and fundamentally dishonest. Where Hegel saw reason unfolding in history, Schopenhauer saw blind will producing endless suffering. Where Hegel found dialectical progress, Schopenhauer found meaningless repetition. Where Hegel celebrated the rational structure of reality, Schopenhauer insisted reality was fundamentally irrational. The two men were examining the same world and reaching opposite conclusions. The personal dimension of the rivalry emerged in 1820 when Schopenhauer joined the University of Berlin as a lecturer. Hegel was then at the height of his power and prestige, occupying the chair of philosophy that had previously been held by Fichte. He was the dominant figure in German academic philosophy. His lectures were packed with students. His influence extended throughout the university system. Appointments, publications, and reputation depended partly on one's relationship to Hegelian philosophy. Schopenhauer made his catastrophic decision to schedule his lectures at exactly the same time as Hegel's. His motivation was partly arrogance. He believed students would recognize his superiority once they heard him, and partly contempt for Hegel personally. Schopenhauer thought Hegel was a fraud whose popularity proved only that the masses prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths. He wanted to challenge Hegel directly and expose him as inferior. The result was predictable. Students crowded Hegel's lectures while Schopenhauer spoke to nearly empty rooms. The humiliation was complete. Schopenhauer left Berlin after one semester and never returned to academic life. This failure deepened his hatred of Hegel and convinced him that academic philosophy was irredeemably corrupt. Hegel's success, in Schopenhauer's view, was proof that universities rewarded mediocrity and punished genuine insight. The philosophical differences between them were fundamental. Hegel's system was built on the concept of dialectical development. Thesis meets antithesis and produces synthesis, which becomes a new thesis. Through this process, contradictions are overcome and higher forms of understanding emerge. History is the record of this dialectical progress. Political systems evolve toward greater freedom. Philosophical thought moves toward absolute knowledge. The suffering and conflict in the world are temporary stages in spirit's journey toward self-realization. Schopenhauer rejected this entirely. He saw no progress in history, only repetition. The same basic problems, suffering, conflict, death, recur in every generation. Political systems change, but human misery remains constant. Philosophical thought does not advance toward truth. Most philosophers, including Hegel, produce elaborate illusions that obscure reality rather than revealing it. The suffering in the world is not a stage to be overcome. It is the permanent condition of existence. Hegel's philosophy was systematic in the extreme. He attempted to incorporate all of reality, nature, history, art, religion, philosophy, into a single comprehensive framework. Every element had its place in the dialectical development of spirit. Contradictions were not eliminated, but aufgehoben, a German word meaning both cancelled and preserved at a higher level. The system aimed at completeness and closure. Schopenhauer's philosophy was also systematic, but in a different way. He claimed to have identified the single key to existence, the will, and shown how everything follows from this insight. But his system was not progressive or developmental. It was static, showing the eternal structure of a reality that does not evolve. Where Hegel's system moved forward toward resolution, Schopenhauer's system circled back to the same fundamental problem. The will generates suffering, and suffering is inescapable except through temporary and partial negations of the will. Their ethical views were opposed. Hegel believed that morality develops historically and finds its highest expression in the rational state. The individual achieves freedom by recognizing themselves as part of a larger social and historical process. Duty consists in fulfilling one's role in the ethical community. The state is the march of God through history, the realization of human freedom in concrete form. Schopenhauer found this obscene. The state is not divine, it is a necessary evil. a mechanism for preventing violence by threatening worse violence. Morality has nothing to do with historical development or social roles. It is based on compassion, the direct recognition of oneself in another being. The state may be necessary, but it should never be glorified. And history is not progressive. Today's states are no more moral than ancient ones. They are simply organized violence on a larger and more efficient scale. Their views on religion also diverged. Hegel attempted to reconcile Christianity with philosophy, arguing that religious imagery expresses philosophical truths in symbolic form. The Trinity represents dialectical structure. The Incarnation represents the unity of finite and infinite. Crucifixion and resurrection represent the process by which spirit overcomes alienation. Philosophy for Hegel preserves the content of religion while translating it into rational concepts. Schopenhauer dismissed this as apologetics. Christianity contains some insights, particularly about suffering and compassion, but these are obscured by supernatural mythology. The idea of a personal God who creates and judges is fundamentally mistaken. The will is not a person and does not care about humanity. Immortality of the individual soul is an illusion. The only element of truth in Christianity is the recognition that this world is a vale of tears and that redemption requires something beyond worldly striving. But Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism, express these insights more clearly without Christian distortions. Stylistically, the two philosophers were opposites. Hegel's prose is notoriously difficult, dense with technical terminology and dialectical complications. His sentences wind through multiple subordinate clauses, qualifications, and conceptual distinctions. Reading Hegel requires sustained effort and often specialized training. Critics, including Schopenhauer, accused him of deliberate obscurity, of hiding the poverty of his ideas behind impressive-sounding jargon. Schopenhauer wrote clearly and forcefully. He used concrete examples, vivid metaphors, and straightforward arguments. His essays and aphorisms are accessible to educated readers without philosophical training. He took pride in his clarity and considered it evidence of genuine understanding. He believed that thinkers who truly grasp their subject can explain it simply. Obscurity, he insisted, is a sign of confused thinking or deliberate deception. Politically, they occupied different positions. Hegel was a moderate conservative who supported the Prussian state and believed in gradual reform within existing institutions. He was suspicious of revolutionary change and believed that reason manifests itself in history through established forms. He held prestigious academic positions and was closely associated with the Prussian government. Schopenhauer was politically indifferent but temperamentally reactionary. He despised revolutionary movements and democratic politics, viewing them as expressions of the will's stupidity on a mass scale. He supported monarchy not because he believed it was progressive, but because he believed all political systems are bad and monarchy is at least stable. He had no political ambitions and no interest in reforming society. He thought human nature was fixed and that political arrangements could at best minimize violence, not create justice or happiness. The personal animosity was intense and one-sided. Hegel seems to have been largely unaware of Schopenhauer's existence. He never mentioned him in his work or correspondence. Schopenhauer, by contrast, was obsessed with Hegel. His notebooks and published works are filled with denunciations. He called Hegel a charlatan, a sophist, a corrupter of minds, and worse. He blamed Hegel personally for the degraded state of German philosophy. He predicted accurately that Hegel's influence would eventually fade while his own work would endure. The rivalry continued even after Hegel's death in 1831. Schopenhauer published expanded editions of his work with prefaces attacking Hegel and Hegelian philosophy. He wrote essays mocking Hegel's style and exposing what he saw as logical absurdities in the system. He took satisfaction in any sign that Hegelian influence was declining. In his final years, when he achieved recognition, he saw it partly as vindication against the Hegelian establishment that had ignored him. The conflict between Schopenhauer and Hegel represents something larger than personal rivalry. It represents two fundamentally different ways of doing philosophy and two fundamentally different assessments of the human situation. Hegel represents the Enlightenment faith in reason, progress, and systematic knowledge. Schopenhauer represents doubt about reason's power, rejection of progress narratives, and insistence on confronting uncomfortable truths about existence. Neither won completely. Hegelian philosophy dominated German universities for decades after Hegel's death, but its influence eventually declined. Schopenhauer's philosophy remained marginal during his lifetime, but grew influential in the late 19th century. Later philosophers, including Nietzsche, absorbed insights from both while rejecting their systems. 20th century philosophy moved beyond both, though elements of each tradition remain active. The rivalry also illustrates a perennial tension in philosophy between systematic completeness and clarity, between optimism and pessimism, between faith in historical meaning and suspicion that history is merely repetition. These tensions continue to structure philosophical debate. Every generation produces thinkers who resemble Hegel in their ambition to comprehend everything systematically, and thinkers who resemble Schopenhauer in their insistence on reality's essential darkness. The argument that began in Berlin in 1820 has never been fully resolved because it addresses questions that may not have final answers. Women and will, his most controversial ideas. Schopenhauer's views on women were harsh, unpleasant, and influential. They represented some of his most extreme and least defensible positions. He wrote an essay titled On Women that combined biological essentialism, social conservatism, and personal bitterness into a systematic account of female inferiority. These views were controversial even in his own time, though many of his contemporaries shared similar prejudices. Today they are rightly condemned, but they require examination both to understand his complete philosophy and to see how philosophical error can flow from personal pathology. His central claim was that women are intellectually and morally inferior to men. He argued that women lack the capacity for abstract thought, genuine creativity, and ethical reasoning. They live entirely in the present moment, responding to immediate circumstances without reflection on larger principles or long-term consequences. They are incapable of appreciating art, philosophy, or science at the highest levels. Their intelligence is practical but shallow, suited for managing households but not for grappling with fundamental questions. He attributed these supposed differences to biology. Women exist primarily for reproduction. Nature has designed them for attracting mates and bearing children, not for intellectual achievement. Their physical beauty peaks in youth because reproductive capacity peaks in youth. Their emotional nature is oriented toward childcare. They are nurturing and compassionate toward children, but lack broader sympathetic identification. Their shorter stature, weaker muscles, and different proportions all reflect their reproductive function. From this biological foundation, Schopenhauer derived social conclusions. Women should not participate in politics, philosophy, or any activity requiring sustained abstract reasoning. They should not have legal equality with men because they lack the judgment to exercise such equality responsibly. They should be under the protection and control of men, first their fathers, then their husbands. Education for women should focus on practical domestic skills, not on intellectual development. He claimed that women are more deceptive than men because deception is their evolutionary strategy. Lacking physical strength, they survive through manipulation. They pretend to emotions they do not feel. They feign intellectual interest to attract men. They use beauty and charm as weapons to achieve their goals. Men are honest and straightforward by comparison. This fundamental dishonesty makes women untrustworthy in matters requiring integrity. He also argued that women are responsible for transmitting stupidity across generations. Intelligence, he claimed, comes from the father. Women contribute only physical characteristics. A brilliant man who marries a beautiful but unintelligent woman will have stupid children. The obsession with female beauty therefore works against human intellectual progress. Nature tricks men into selecting mates based on reproductive fitness rather than intelligence, perpetuating mediocrity. These views reflected several sources. First, his relationship with his mother was catastrophically bad. Johanna Schopenhauer was intelligent, successful, and socially ambitious. She found her son unbearable and told him so. Their mutual contempt became legendary. Arthur never forgave her for what he perceived as callousness about his father's death and for prioritizing her social life over maternal duties. His writings on women consistently returned to themes of maternal inadequacy and female selfishness. Second, his philosophy of sexual love made him deeply suspicious of women's role in reproduction. He believed sexual attraction was nature's mechanism for enslaving men to the species' reproductive goals. Women, as the primary bearers of children, were the primary instruments of this enslavement. His resentment at sexual desire itself, which he experienced as tyrannical and degrading, transferred onto women as the objects of that desire. Third, his own isolation and failure to form lasting relationships with women reinforced his negative views. He never married, never sustained a romantic partnership, and apparently never found emotional intimacy with a woman. His sexual relationships were commercial or brief affairs. His lack of positive experience with women as equals or companions made it easier to maintain theoretical views of their inferiority. Fourth, he was influenced by the prevailing views of his time and culture. Early 19th century Europe was profoundly patriarchal. Women had limited legal rights, restricted educational opportunities, and were largely excluded from public life. Schopenhauer absorbed and systematized these cultural prejudices. giving them a philosophical gloss. His views on women were more extreme than the average, but they were not aberrations from his cultural context. However, these explanations do not excuse the views. They were wrong on empirical grounds. Women are not intellectually inferior to men, as subsequent history has demonstrated beyond doubt. They were wrong on ethical grounds. Denying people equality based on biological characteristics is fundamentally unjust. They were wrong on philosophical grounds. They contradicted his own principle that all beings share the same essential nature as manifestations of the will. The contradiction is worth noting. Schopenhauer's ethics was based on recognizing the essential identity of all suffering beings. When you harm another, you harm yourself at the deepest level because the will is one. This principle should apply equally to women. They suffer, they are driven by the same will, they are subject to the same fundamental conditions of existence. Yet Schopenhauer treated women as essentially different and inferior, as if they were not full participants in the human condition. One possible interpretation, more charitable than his explicit statements warrant, is that he was describing differences in how the will manifests in women versus men. Women, being more directly involved in reproduction, might be more completely dominated by the will's reproductive imperative. Men, less biologically constrained by reproduction, might have more capacity for will denial through art, philosophy, and asceticism. This would make women and men different expressions of the same underlying will, rather than fundamentally different kinds of beings. But Schopenhauer did not develop this interpretation consistently. His actual writings on women treat them as simply inferior, rather than as differently positioned in relation to the will. He did not explore how women might have their own paths to will denial, or their own forms of genuine insight. He simply dismissed them as incapable of the higher achievements he valued. His views had consequences. They reinforced existing prejudices and provided philosophical justification for excluding women from intellectual and public life. Later thinkers who admired Schopenhauer sometimes absorbed his misogyny along with his insights about suffering and the will. The association between philosophical pessimism and hostility to women persisted in some circles, though it was never logically necessary. Modern readers approaching Schopenhauer must reckon with this aspect of his thought. Several strategies are possible. One is to reject him entirely, considering his views on women disqualifying. Another is to separate his insights about suffering, will, and compassion from his personal prejudices about women, taking what is valuable and discarding what is indefensible. A third is to read his views on women as a cautionary example of how even brilliant thinkers can be blinded by personal pathology and cultural prejudice. The third approach is perhaps most instructive. Schopenhauer saw himself as unusually clear-sighted, free from the illusions that trap most people. Yet he was trapped in the illusions of his time and place regarding women. He claimed to value compassion for all suffering beings, but showed little compassion for half of humanity. He celebrated intellectual honesty, but was intellectually dishonest about an entire category of human experience. His failure illustrates how difficult it is to see clearly, how easily philosophical insight in one area coexists with profound blindness in another. His views on women also reveal the limits of his philosophy. He developed a sophisticated account of suffering, will, and liberation, but he applied it inconsistently. He recognized that the will operates through all living things, but he ranked these manifestations hierarchically, with women below men. He advocated compassion based on recognizing shared nature, but he denied that recognition to women. These inconsistencies suggest problems with his system, places where personal prejudice distorted philosophical insight. It is also worth considering what Schopenhauer might have written if he had examined women's experience more carefully and sympathetically. Women experience desire, suffering, and the tyranny of the will just as men do. They experience the conflict between individual needs and reproductive imperatives. They navigate the hedgehog's dilemma in relationships. They seek relief from suffering through art, compassion, and understanding. A philosophy truly attentive to these experiences might have looked different, might have incorporated insights Schopenhauer missed. His essay On Women is the clearest case where his philosophy failed not because his central insights were wrong, but because he failed to apply them universally. The lesson is not that Schopenhauer was simply a misogynist, though he was, but that philosophical systems, however powerful, are always incomplete and always subject to the limitations and prejudices of their creators. No thinker, however brilliant, transcends their historical moment completely. All philosophy is provisional, requiring ongoing criticism, revision, and development. Contemporary readers can engage with Schopenhauer's philosophy while rejecting his views on women. His analysis of suffering, desire, and will denial remains valuable. His insights about compassion and the unity of all beings remain important, but these insights must be applied consistently to all human beings regardless of gender. The philosophical tools Schopenhauer developed can be used to critique the very prejudices he held, to build a more complete and consistent philosophy of human existence. Compassion, the only way out of hell. After identifying life as suffering and tracing suffering to the blind will that drives all existence, Schopenhauer turned to ethics. How should we act in a world structured by suffering? What makes an action morally good or bad? His answer was radical. Genuine morality has one foundation only: compassion, the direct perception of another being's suffering as your own. Traditional Western ethics offered several alternative foundations. Divine command theory said actions are right when God commands them. Kantian ethics said actions are right when they follow universal principles that reason can discover. Utilitarian ethics said actions are right when they maximize overall happiness. Virtue ethics said actions are right when they express good character traits. Schopenhauer rejected all of these. Divine command theory requires belief in God, which Schopenhauer considered unjustified. Moreover, obedience to commands is not genuine morality. It is prudence based on fear of punishment or hope for reward. A person who acts morally only because God commands it has no real moral motivation, only self-interest dressed in religious language. Kantian ethics was closer to Schopenhauer's position but still inadequate. Kant argued that moral actions must be done from duty, following universal principles that reason endorses. But Schopenhauer insisted that reason alone cannot motivate action. Reason can discover logical relationships and assess means to ends, but it cannot generate the fundamental impulse to act morally. Something deeper than reason must be involved. Utilitarianism failed because it required impossible calculations. How can you determine which action maximizes overall happiness when consequences extend infinitely into the future and affect countless beings? Moreover, maximizing happiness assumes happiness is a positive good rather than merely temporary relief from suffering. Schopenhauer's analysis suggested that permanent happiness is impossible, so pursuing it as a moral goal is incoherent. Virtue ethics focused on character, but Schopenhauer had already argued that character is not chosen. You do not decide to be courageous or temperate. You discover what kind of character you have through experience. Praising someone for their virtues is like praising them for being tall. It reflects fortunate constitution, not moral achievement. His own foundation for ethics was compassion, which he called mitleid, literally, suffering with. Compassion is the immediate, intuitive recognition that another being's pain is not fundamentally different from your own pain. When you see someone suffering and feel their suffering as directly as if it were happening to you, you are experiencing the truth that underlies all moral behavior. This recognition is possible because of the metaphysical truth that the will is one. Although we appear to be separate individuals, at the deepest level there is no separation. The same will that drives you drives every other being. When you harm another, you are actually harming yourself, though the illusion of individuality prevents you from seeing this immediately. Compassion is the moment when the illusion falls away and you recognize essential identity with the other. Schopenhauer distinguished three fundamental motives for human action. The first is egoism, acting for your own benefit. This is by far the most common motive. Most human action is directed towards satisfying personal desires, avoiding personal pain, and advancing personal interests. Egoism itself is not wrong. It is natural and inevitable given that we are manifestations of the will. But it is not moral. It is pre-moral, the baseline from which morality must emerge. The second motive is malice, acting to cause harm. Some people actively enjoy others' suffering. They feel satisfaction when competitors fail, pleasure when enemies are hurt, joy when witnessing humiliation. This is rarer than egoism, but still common enough. Malice is morally bad in the clearest sense. It represents the will at its most destructive, turned against itself with full consciousness. The third motive is compassion, acting to relieve another's suffering. This is the only genuinely moral motive. When you act from compassion, you are not seeking your own benefit. You are responding to another's pain as if it were your own. This is the foundation of all moral behavior, helping others, refraining from harm, showing kindness. Everything moral reduces to compassion. Everything immoral is either absence of compassion or active malice. He illustrated this with simple examples. You see a child drowning. If you jump in to save the child, what motivates you? Not duty or rational principle. There is no time for such reflection. Not calculation of maximum happiness. You do not weigh consequences. Not divine command. You do not think about God's will. You act immediately because you cannot bear the child's suffering. The barrier between you and the child dissolves momentarily, and you act to end suffering that you experience as directly as if it were your own. Or consider why murder is wrong. Not because God forbids it, not because it violates a categorical imperative, not because it decreases overall utility. Murder is wrong because it causes immense suffering to the victim and to those who love the victim. When you truly perceive this suffering, when you feel it as your own, you cannot murder. The inability to murder comes from compassion, not from rules or reason. Schopenhauer traced different degrees of moral behavior to different degrees of compassion. The basic level is refraining from harm. You do not injure others because you recognize that injury hurts. This is minimal morality, simply not adding to the world's suffering. The next level is active help. You see someone in need and provide assistance. This requires more compassion because it costs you effort or resources. The highest level is complete identification with others, where their suffering matters as much as your own. This is rare and approaches sainthood. Justice, in Schopenhauer's ethics, is simply the absence of injustice, which is the absence of actively causing harm. A just person does not steal, assault, defraud, or exploit. This sounds minimal, but it is actually demanding. Most people regularly harm others when it benefits them, justifying it through rationalizations. True justice requires consistent recognition of others' right to exist without interference. Loving kindness goes beyond justice. It involves actively working to reduce others' suffering. This is what we recognize as moral goodness: helping the poor, comforting the grieving, healing the sick, protecting the vulnerable. These actions spring from compassion, from inability to remain indifferent to suffering. The loving person sees suffering and responds as naturally as they would respond to their own pain. Schopenhauer extended this analysis to animals. Animals suffer. They feel pain, fear, hunger, and exhaustion. The will operates in them as it does in humans. Therefore, compassion should extend to animals. Causing animal suffering is wrong for the same reason causing human suffering is wrong. Western ethics had generally excluded animals from moral consideration, treating them as mere things. Schopenhauer insisted this was indefensible. If moral status comes from the capacity to suffer, animals qualify completely. His defense of animal welfare was far ahead of his time. He condemned vivisection, hunting for sport, and casual cruelty to animals. He advocated vegetarianism, though he apparently did not practice it consistently himself. He argued that any ethical system that excludes animals from consideration is incomplete. The fact that animals cannot reason or use language is irrelevant. What matters is that they suffer, and compassion responds to suffering, regardless of the sufferer's species. This position follows logically from his metaphysics. If the will is one and manifests in all living things, then the boundary between human and animal is superficial. We are all temporary forms of the same underlying reality. Harming an animal is not fundamentally different from harming a human. Both actions inflict suffering on manifestations of the will. Compassion recognizes this and responds to all suffering equally. Schopenhauer's ethics is remarkable for what it excludes. There are no rules, no commandments, no calculations. There is only the simple test. Does the action spring from compassion or not? If yes, it is moral. If no, it is not. This makes ethics both simple and demanding. Simple because the criterion is clear. Demanding because genuine compassion is rare and requires seeing through the illusion of separateness. He acknowledged that most people rarely act from pure compassion. Egoism dominates most behavior, but even occasional moments of compassion matter. They are moments when consciousness briefly escapes the will's tyranny, when the barrier between self and other falls away, when action flows from truth rather than illusion. These moments, though fleeting, point toward a different way of being. Compassion also provides temporary relief from suffering. When you act from genuine compassion, you momentarily forget yourself and your own desires. You are not striving for anything personal. You are simply responding to what is in front of you. This cessation of personal striving is peaceful. It does not eliminate your own suffering permanently, but it provides relief in the moment of compassionate action. Critics pointed out apparent problems. If compassion is the foundation of morality, what about conflicting obligations? What if compassion for one being requires harming another? Schopenhauer did not develop detailed answers to such questions. His ethics was foundational rather than comprehensive. He identified the basic principle, but left its application to practical situations underdeveloped. Another objection: if character is determined and we cannot choose our desires, can we be moral at all? Schopenhauer's answer was that some people have compassionate characters and others do not. You cannot make yourself compassionate through effort of will. but you can recognize whether compassion arises in you, and you can act on it when it does. Moral behavior flows from character, and character is not chosen. But this does not make morality impossible, just different from what traditional ethics assumed. Modern ethical theory has moved in various directions since Schopenhauer, but his core insight remains important. Compassion is central to moral life in ways that rules and principles cannot capture. The capacity to feel another's suffering as your own, to be motivated by their pain rather than by abstract duty or calculated benefit, this is the heart of genuine moral action. Schopenhauer saw clearly that ethics must be grounded in something immediate and felt, not in something abstract and reasoned. His ethics connects to his broader philosophy. Compassion is possible because the will is one. Liberation from suffering is possible through art, understanding, and will denial. Compassion is a form of will denial, a moment when personal desire falls silent and you act for another without seeking benefit. It is both morally good and a path toward the peace that comes from escaping the will's demands. Ethics and metaphysics converge in the recognition that we are not separate, that all suffering is one suffering, and that compassion is seeing this truth and acting on it. Retrim Dals He, Animals Suffer Too, writes before it was cool. Long before animal rights became a social movement, before factory farming drew widespread criticism, before vegetarianism moved from eccentricity to mainstream acceptance, Schopenhauer insisted that animals deserve moral consideration. His position was radical for the 19th century and remains challenging today. He argued that excluding animals from ethical concern is not merely mistaken, but reveals a fundamental failure to grasp the nature of morality itself. The argument began with a simple observation. Animals suffer. They feel pain when injured. They experience fear when threatened. They become exhausted from labor. They starve when deprived of food. Anyone who has observed animals closely knows this. A dog yelps when stepped on. A horse struggles desperately to escape fire. A pig screams when slaughtered. The sounds and behaviors of animal suffering are unmistakable. Western philosophy and religion had generally dismissed animal suffering as morally insignificant. Descartes notoriously claimed that animals are mere machines, that their cries of pain are no different from the creaking of a wheel. They lack souls and consciousness, so they cannot truly suffer. Christian theology taught that animals exist for human use, that God gave humanity dominion over them, and that they have no moral status independent of human interests. Even philosophers who rejected Cartesian mechanism often excluded animals from moral consideration on the grounds that they lack reason or language. Schopenhauer found all of this contemptible. The capacity to suffer, not the capacity to reason or speak, is what grounds moral status. An animal that feels pain has a morally relevant interest in not being caused pain. This interest exists regardless of whether the animal can articulate it in language or derive it from rational principles. Pain is pain, whether experienced by a human or a dog. To dismiss animal suffering because animals cannot reason is like dismissing the suffering of human infants or severely mentally disabled humans because they cannot reason. The criterion is wrong. His metaphysics supported this ethical position. The will manifests itself at different levels of complexity, from inorganic forces through plants to animals to humans. But it is the same will in all cases. The inner nature of a dog is not fundamentally different from the inner nature of a human. Both are temporary manifestations of the blind will to live. Both experience drives, desires, and the suffering that comes from wanting. The differences are of degree and complexity, not of kind. When you kick a dog, you are not harming a mere machine or a thing. You are causing suffering to a being whose inner nature is identical to your own at the deepest level. The dog's pain is not less real or less morally significant than human pain. It may be simpler, less layered with anticipation and memory, but it is genuine suffering. Compassion, properly understood, extends to all beings capable of suffering, human and animal alike. Schopenhauer was particularly harsh in his criticism of vivisection, the practice of experimenting on living animals. Medical researchers of his era commonly performed surgeries on unanesthetized animals to study anatomy and physiology. They justified this by claiming it advanced scientific knowledge that would benefit humanity. Schopenhauer called it torture. The fact that useful knowledge might result did not justify inflicting agony on sentient beings. The ends do not justify the means when the means involve causing unbearable suffering to creatures incapable of consenting. He extended his criticism to hunting for sport. Killing animals for food might be defended as necessary for survival, though he questioned even this. But killing animals for entertainment, for the pleasure of the chase and the kill, revealed moral bankruptcy. The hunter who delights in shooting deer or birds for amusement is displaying the same malice he displays when he harms humans, only directed at beings who cannot defend themselves or appeal to law. Sport hunting is pure cruelty, pleasure taken in causing death. He also condemned casual cruelty to animals, the everyday violence people inflict without thought, beating horses to make them work harder, overloading pack animals until they collapse, keeping animals in miserable conditions because their comfort is inconvenient, tormenting animals for fun. These actions reveal a person's character. Someone who treats animals cruelly will, if given the chance and sufficient motive, treat humans cruelly. Compassion is indivisible. You cannot genuinely feel compassion for humans while remaining indifferent to animal suffering. Schopenhauer advocated for vegetarianism, though his personal practice was inconsistent. He recognized that eating meat causes animal suffering and that this suffering is unnecessary for human survival. Plant-based diets can sustain health. Therefore, eating meat is choosing pleasure and convenience over animal welfare. He believed that as human moral consciousness evolved, people would increasingly recognize the wrongness of meat eating and would shift toward plant-based diets. His advocacy was more than a century ahead of mainstream acceptance. In the early 19th century, vegetarianism was rare and often viewed as eccentric or fanatical. Most people gave no thought to the suffering involved in meat production. Animals were property, resources, tools. The idea that they had interests deserving protection was alien to most Europeans. Schopenhauer stood against this consensus, insisting that future generations would look back with horror at the casual cruelty of his age. He connected animal ethics to broader themes in his philosophy. Animals cannot deny the will to live through reason or ascetic practice. They are trapped more completely than humans in the cycle of desire and suffering. They cannot understand their situation or imagine alternatives. This makes them more pitiable, not less deserving of consideration. They suffer without the consolations of art, philosophy, or religion. They are innocent victims of the will's blind drive to perpetuate itself. He also noted that humans have created artificial forms of animal suffering that do not exist in nature. Domestication has produced animals entirely dependent on human care. Farm animals have been bred for traits that serve human interests, but cause the animals discomfort or disability. Animals are confined in ways that frustrate their natural behaviors. The suffering humans inflict on animals exceeds what animals inflict on each other in wild conditions. This imposes special obligations. If you breed creatures into existence and control their lives completely, you are responsible for their welfare. The legal status of animals troubled him. Under law, animals are property. You can own a dog as you own a chair. This status permits treatment that would be criminal if directed at humans. You can buy and sell animals, breed them, confine them, kill them, all as exercises of property rights. Schopenhauer believed this legal framework was morally wrong. Animals are not things. They are subjects of experience with interests that deserve recognition. Law should protect those interests, not treat animals as mere objects for human use. He praised cultures and traditions that showed greater respect for animal life. He admired Buddhism and Hinduism for their teachings of ahimsa, nonviolence toward all living beings. He noted that in India, hospitals existed to treat sick and injured animals. He contrasted this with European treatment of animals as purely instrumental. Western civilization, for all its claimed moral superiority, was morally inferior to Eastern cultures in its treatment of animals. His position anticipated many arguments that would later become central to animal rights philosophy. Peter Singer's utilitarian argument that animals deserve equal consideration of their interests echoes Schopenhauer's insistence that suffering matters regardless of species. Tom Regan's rights-based approach, emphasizing that animals are subjects of a life, reflects Schopenhauer's view that animals are not mere things, but beings with inner experience. The entire modern animal welfare movement builds on foundations Schopenhauer helped establish. Critics raise several objections. If we extend moral consideration to animals, where do we stop? Do insects deserve protection? What about plants, which also strive to live? Schopenhauer acknowledged the difficulty, but insisted that the line must be drawn based on capacity to suffer. Mammals clearly suffer, birds suffer. Reptiles and fish likely suffer, though perhaps less intensely. Insects are less certain. Plants show no evidence of subjective experience. The boundary may be unclear in some cases, but this does not invalidate the principle. Uncertainty about borderline cases does not justify ignoring clear cases. Another objection: animals kill and eat each other. Why should humans refrain from doing what nature does constantly? Schopenhauer's response was that natural behavior does not determine moral obligation. Animals act from instinct without moral awareness. Humans can reflect on their actions and choose based on ethical principles. The fact that lions kill zebras does not justify human violence. We are capable of compassion and should act on it, even if other creatures cannot. A practical objection: complete consistency would require impossibly restrictive behavior. You cannot walk without killing insects. You cannot farm without harming field animals. You cannot live in a house without displacing creatures who lived there first. Schopenhauer did not claim absolute non-harm was possible. He argued for minimizing harm where reasonably possible. Unavoidable harm is different from deliberate cruelty or unnecessary killing. The goal is not perfection, but reduction of suffering within practical limits. His views on animals also reveal consistency in his philosophy that his views on women lacked. He applied his principle that suffering matters wherever it occurs. He recognized that apparent differences between beings are superficial compared to the fundamental unity of the will. He extended compassion across species boundaries, just as he urged extending it across human social boundaries. In this area, his philosophy worked as it should, applying its insights universally. Modern factory farming would have appalled him. The industrial-scale suffering of billions of animals raised in confinement, bred for traits that caused them pain, slaughtered in massive numbers. This represents precisely the kind of institutionalized cruelty he condemned. The efficiency and scope are new, but the underlying indifference to animal suffering is the same moral failure he identified in his own time. His legacy in animal ethics is substantial. He influenced later thinkers who developed more systematic animal rights theories. He provided philosophical grounding for intuitions many people felt but could not articulate. He showed that taking animals seriously is not sentimentality but follows from clear ethical principles. He demonstrated that a philosophy claiming to address suffering must address animal suffering or risk incoherence. The growing recognition of animal welfare in contemporary society partially vindicates Schopenhauer's prediction. More people now question meat eating, oppose animal experimentation, and support legal protections for animals. Progress is slow and incomplete, but the direction is toward greater recognition of animal interests. Whether this trend continues or reverses depends on whether future generations accept or reject the basic insight Schopenhauer expressed: that suffering matters, that animals suffer, and that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong regardless of the victim species. His writing on animals shows him at his most consistent and humane. Here, the misanthropy that marked other areas of his thought gave way to genuine compassion. He felt deeply for creatures who suffer without understanding why, who cannot protest their treatment, who depend entirely on human mercy. This compassion was not sentimental. It was grounded in clear recognition of shared nature and shared suffering. It represents perhaps the best application of his philosophy, the place where his insights into the will, suffering, and compassion came together most successfully. The Art of Being Alone, and Why Crowds Make You Stupid. Schopenhauer spent most of his adult life alone. This was partly circumstance and partly choice. He could have made more effort to maintain friendships, to participate in social life, to build a community around himself. He chose not to. He lived in solitude, ate alone, walked alone, worked alone, and he insisted that this was not merely acceptable but superior to the alternative. Solitude, properly understood, is not deprivation, but liberation. His defense of solitude began with an attack on sociability. Most people fear being alone. They fill their time with social activities not because these activities are valuable, but because they cannot bear their own company. They seek distraction in conversation, entertainment in crowds, validation in social recognition. This desperate flight from solitude reveals inner poverty. A person with a rich inner life does not need constant external stimulation. A person with nothing inside themselves cannot tolerate being alone with that nothing. Social life, in Schopenhauer's analysis, is mostly waste. Conversation is typically shallow, consisting of gossip, pleasantries, and the exchange of conventional opinions. People rarely say what they actually think. They perform social roles, displaying the personality they want others to see rather than expressing genuine thoughts. Most social interaction is a form of mutual deception, with everyone pretending to be more interesting, successful, and content than they are. Crowds particularly disgusted him. When people gather in groups, individual intelligence drops dramatically. Crowds respond to emotional appeals, follow popular opinions without examination, and amplify the worst human tendencies. The individual who might think clearly when alone becomes stupid in a crowd. Mob psychology takes over. Nuance disappears. Complexity becomes impossible. The lowest common denominator dominates. He observed that truly significant intellectual and creative work requires solitude. Philosophers need quiet to think deeply. Artists need isolation to create. Writers need freedom from interruption to develop ideas. The constant stimulation of social life fragments attention and prevents the sustained focus necessary for genuine achievement. Show him a person constantly surrounded by others, and he will show you someone producing nothing of lasting value. Solitude also protects independence. Other people influence how you think and what you value. Social pressure pushes toward conformity. The desire for approval shapes behavior. The fear of criticism silences honest expression. When alone, you escape these pressures. Your thoughts are your own. You can follow ideas wherever they lead without worrying about others' reactions. You can develop opinions that contradict social consensus without facing immediate challenge. He distinguished between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness is suffering from the absence of desired company. Solitude is chosen isolation that enables activities impossible in company. Lonely people want connection and suffer without it. Solitary people prefer independence and suffer when forced into social contact. Most people conflate the two, assuming anyone alone must be lonely. This reveals their own inability to value solitude. The capacity for solitude correlates with intellectual depth. Intelligent people can entertain themselves with thought. They read, reflect, observe, and find these activities absorbing. They do not need others to fill time because time alone is not empty. Stupid people, by contrast, have nothing to occupy themselves when alone. They become bored immediately. They reach for distractions, trivial entertainment, mindless socializing, anything to escape confrontation with their own mental poverty. Schopenhauer acknowledged that humans are social animals with genuine needs for some connection. Complete isolation drives most people toward madness. But the amount of social contact people need is far less than most assume. Brief, substantive interaction suffices. Hours spent with others mostly serves to waste time and fragment attention. The person who maintains distance, who limits social contact to what is genuinely valuable, lives more productively and peacefully than the social butterfly. He was particularly critical of social ambition, the desire for status and recognition. People sacrifice enormous amounts of time and energy to social climbing. They cultivate connections with powerful individuals. They attend tedious events to be seen. They monitor their reputation obsessively. They measure their worth by others' opinions. All of this is vanity, smoke, nothing. When you die, social status dies with you. The respect of fools is worthless. Only genuine achievement matters, and achievement requires solitude more than sociability. The truly independent person does not care what others think. This is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable. Most people are enslaved to public opinion. They modify their behavior, suppress their thoughts, and perform acceptable personalities to maintain social standing. This slavery is more oppressive than physical chains because people embrace it willingly, even desperately. The person who breaks free, who genuinely stops caring about social approval, achieves a freedom most never experience. He offered practical advice for cultivating independence. Limit social contact to what is necessary or genuinely enjoyable. Do not attend social events merely to maintain connections or avoid seeming antisocial. Ignore fashion and conventional opinion when forming judgments. Read widely rather than limiting yourself to currently popular authors. Develop interests that can be pursued alone. Intellectual work, art, observation of nature. Accept that living independently means being misunderstood and sometimes criticized. This cost is worth paying. His own life exemplified this advice, though not always attractively. His isolation was successful in that he produced substantial philosophical work that might not have been possible with more social engagement. His rigid routine, his avoidance of close relationships, his indifference to social opinion, these enabled sustained focus on his ideas. He lived as he advised others to live. But his isolation also revealed limitations. His lack of close relationships meant no one challenged his ideas in sustained, sympathetic dialogue. His absence of intimate connection may have contributed to his misogyny and misanthropy. His withdrawal from social life prevented him from fully understanding ordinary human experience. His philosophy might have been richer if he had engaged more genuinely with others rather than retreating into defensive solitude. The hedgehog's dilemma is relevant here. Schopenhauer chose to stay in the cold rather than risk the pricks of closeness. This was a coherent choice given his priorities and temperament. But it was not the only possible choice. Others might find a balance that accepts some conflict in exchange for more warmth. His solution worked for him, but need not be universal. Modern psychology recognizes different personality types with different social needs. Introverts recharge through solitude and find extensive social contact draining. Extroverts recharge through social interaction and find too much solitude draining. Neither type is inherently superior. Schopenhauer was an extreme introvert who universalized his own temperament, claiming everyone would benefit from more solitude. This was overreach. Many people genuinely thrive with more social contact than he could tolerate, but his core insight remains valuable. Contemporary life pushes toward constant connectivity. Technology enables continuous social contact through messages, calls, and social media. Many people report feeling overwhelmed by social demands and unable to find time alone. The skill of being comfortably alone, of not needing constant external stimulation, has become rarer. Schopenhauer's defense of solitude speaks to a contemporary need. His criticism of crowds is also relevant. Social media creates digital crowds with all the pathologies he identified. Emotional contagion spreads rapidly. Nuanced thinking becomes impossible. Mob dynamics dominate. The individual who maintains distance from these digital crowds preserves clearer thinking. The person constantly immersed in online social interaction becomes reactive, performative, unable to sustain independent thought. The advice to ignore social opinion remains radical and necessary. Most people are imprisoned by concern for reputation. They make decisions based on what others will think rather than on what genuinely matters. This slavery prevents authentic living. The person who learns not to care, not through resentful rebellion, but through genuine indifference, achieves a freedom that most never know. Schopenhauer's writing on solitude sometimes veers into arrogance. He too easily dismissed social connection as worthless. He too quickly assumed that preference for solitude indicated superiority. He failed to recognize that some genuine goods are only available through relationship. Certain kinds of understanding, certain experiences of connection, certain forms of growth. His philosophy would have been enriched by acknowledging these goods while still maintaining that solitude is valuable and that many people need more of it than contemporary life provides. The art of being alone, properly understood, is not about rejecting all social contact, but about not being dependent on it. It is having sufficient inner resources that you do not need constant external stimulation. It is being comfortable with your own thoughts and company. It is not requiring others' approval to feel worthwhile. It is finding meaning in activities that can be pursued alone. These capacities do not require total isolation, but they do require regular solitude. Schopenhauer demonstrated that a life centered on solitary intellectual work can be meaningful and productive. He showed that social isolation need not mean misery. He proved that independence from social opinion is possible. Whether this life is preferable to alternatives depends on individual temperament and values, but he established that it is a genuine option, a coherent way of living that deserves respect rather than pity. His example challenges contemporary assumptions about the necessity of extensive social connection. Perhaps we need less than we think. Perhaps much of our social activity is driven by fear of being alone rather than by genuine desire for connection. Perhaps the person who can be happily alone is freer than the person who cannot bear solitude. These possibilities remain worth considering, especially in a culture that increasingly equates social isolation with failure or pathology. Music, the only escape from the will. Among all art forms, Schopenhauer placed music highest. Painting, sculpture, poetry, and drama are valuable, but music occupies a unique position. It is not merely superior to other arts in degree, it is different in kind. Music, alone among the arts, provides direct access to the innermost nature of reality itself. It speaks a language that bypasses concepts and images, communicating the essence of the will without mediation. His explanation began with his account of art generally. Art provides temporary escape from willing. In normal consciousness, we experience the world through the filter of the will. We see objects as potential means to our ends. A tree is firewood or shelter. Another person is a potential ally, enemy, or object of desire. Everything is evaluated in relation to our needs and purposes. This utilitarian perception keeps us trapped in the cycle of desire and suffering. Aesthetic experience is different. When you contemplate a painting or a landscape aesthetically, you stop seeing it as related to your desires. You stop asking what it is for or how it might benefit you. You simply perceive it. You become absorbed in the object itself, forgetting yourself and your purposes. For the duration of aesthetic contemplation, the will falls silent. You are no longer a wanting subject, but a pure, will-less subject of knowledge. This state is peaceful. When wanting stops, suffering stops. The constant pressure of desire, the endless striving, the unsatisfied longing, all of this falls away in aesthetic experience. You are simply aware, perceiving without desire, existing without needing. This is why art provides relief. It offers brief vacation from the tyranny of the will. Different art forms achieve this in different ways. Painting presents visual forms that capture the eternal character of objects, not this particular tree, but the essential nature of trees. Sculpture does the same in 3 dimensions. Architecture creates spaces that embody ideas like strength, grace, or solemnity. Poetry uses language to evoke images and emotions that lift consciousness beyond individual willing. Drama shows human character and conflict in ways that illuminate universal truths about human nature. All these arts work by presenting particular things in ways that reveal their essential, timeless character. They show not the individual object as it relates to our purposes, but the Platonic idea, the eternal form that the object imperfectly manifests. When we grasp this idea aesthetically, we momentarily transcend individual perspective and see things as they are in themselves. But music works differently. It does not represent objects or ideas at all. Music is not about anything external to itself. A symphony does not depict a landscape or tell a story, though it may suggest moods and movements. Music is pure form, patterns of sound unfolding in time. Yet these patterns speak to us with extraordinary directness and power. Music can move us to tears, elevate us to joy, plunge us into melancholy. It communicates something profound without representing anything specific. Schopenhauer's explanation was that music is a direct copy of the will itself. While other arts show the ideas that mediate between the will and the phenomenal world, music bypasses the ideas entirely. It presents the will's own structure, its endless striving, its tensions and resolutions, its surging and subsiding, the rising and falling of melodies, the tension and release of harmonies, the drive toward resolution. All of this mirrors the will's own nature. Consider a simple musical phrase. A melody rises, creating tension and anticipation. It seeks resolution. Notes lead toward other notes. Harmonies create dissonance that demands resolution to consonance. This structure of tension and resolution, of striving and temporary satisfaction, is exactly the structure of willing. Music does not describe this structure, it enacts it. Music is the will made audible. This explains music's extraordinary emotional power. We respond to music so deeply because it speaks directly to our innermost nature. We recognize ourselves in it, not as individual personalities, but as manifestations of the will. The longing in a melody is our longing. The resolution in a cadence is our temporary satisfaction. The melancholy in a minor key is our recognition of suffering. Music bypasses intellect and conceptual understanding to address what we are at the deepest level. Different types of music express different aspects of willing. The bass line represents the most basic forces of nature, the fundamental drive that underlies everything. The middle voices represent animal and human striving. The melody represents conscious human willing with all its complexity. A symphony's structure, with its themes developing through variations and conflicts toward resolution, mirrors the will's process of objectifying itself at different levels. Schopenhauer particularly valued instrumental music, music without words or programs. Once you attach words or a narrative to music, you reduce it to representation. You make it about specific things rather than letting it speak its own language. A poem set to music may be beautiful, but the music is constrained by the text. Pure instrumental music is freer to express the will's nature directly. This is why music affects us without our understanding how or why. You do not need to know music theory to be moved by a symphony. You do not need to understand the composer's intentions. The music speaks directly to something in you that is deeper than knowledge or intention. Children respond to music before they can understand language. People from entirely different cultures can be moved by the same music. This universality reflects music's direct connection to the universal will. He acknowledged that not everyone responds to music with equal intensity. Some people seem deaf to its power, but he suggested this reflects a limitation in their nature rather than in music itself. The person who cannot be deeply moved by great music lacks sensitivity to the deepest aspects of reality. They are trapped entirely in superficial, utilitarian perception and cannot access the dimension music reveals. Great composers in Schopenhauer's view are philosophers who work in sound rather than concepts. Beethoven, Mozart, Rossini, these are thinkers who grasped the nature of the will and expressed it through music. Their compositions are profound truths about existence, expressed in the only medium that can convey such truths directly. Understanding their music is understanding reality itself, though it is a non-conceptual understanding that cannot be translated into words. This is why music occupies a unique position among human achievements. Philosophy can describe the will conceptually. Other arts can show its manifestations in particular forms, but only music presents the will itself, not as concept or image, but as lived, felt experience. Music lets you experience the will's nature from within, not as something observed, but as something you are. The relief music provides is temporary, like all aesthetic experience. When the music stops, willing returns. You are pulled back into the world of needs and purposes. But during the music, genuine peace is possible. You are lifted out of individual striving into pure perception. You cease to be a person with wants and become pure consciousness, experiencing the flow of sound. Schopenhauer played the flute every day for this reason. It was not entertainment. It was a spiritual practice, a daily reminder that escape from willing is possible. Playing music, like listening to it, can provide that momentary freedom. The musician absorbed in performance forgets themselves, their desires, their suffering. They exist entirely in the act of making sound, of bringing the musical structure into being. He also observed that music can express what words cannot. There are emotional states, metaphysical insights, aspects of experience that language fails to capture. Music can convey these directly. A melody can express a kind of longing that has no name. A harmony can suggest a relationship between forces that no concept captures. Music expands the range of what can be communicated, giving voice to what otherwise remains locked inside individual consciousness. Modern neuroscience has confirmed some of Schopenhauer's observations about music's effects. Music activates brain regions associated with emotion and reward more directly than language. It can alter physiological states, heart rate, breathing, stress hormones. It affects us in ways that bypass conscious control. These findings support Schopenhauer's claim that music operates at a level deeper than conceptual thought. Whether music actually is a direct copy of the will remains metaphysically uncertain. But Schopenhauer's phenomenological observation is accurate. Music affects us uniquely, speaks to us in ways nothing else does, and provides an experience of peace that is qualitatively different from other aesthetic experiences. Even if his metaphysical explanation is rejected, the value he placed on music as a source of temporary liberation from suffering remains justified. For Schopenhauer personally, music was essential. In a life largely devoid of human intimacy, music provided connection to something beyond himself. In a philosophy that emphasized suffering as fundamental, music demonstrated that peace is possible. In an existence dedicated to intellectual work, music offered non-conceptual wisdom. His daily flute playing was not a hobby. It was an acknowledgement that philosophy alone is insufficient, that some truths can only be accessed through art, and that among arts, music reaches deepest. How art saves us when nothing else can. Beyond music, Schopenhauer saw all art as providing temporary salvation from suffering. This was not metaphor or exaggeration. He meant it literally. Art offers moments when the fundamental structure of existence, the endless cycle of desire and frustration, falls away, leaving consciousness in a state of pure, will-less perception. These moments are rare and fleeting, but they are real, and they point toward the possibility of more complete liberation. The condition for aesthetic experience is detachment from willing. In ordinary life, perception is entirely practical. You see objects in relation to your needs. Food interests you when hungry. Shelter matters when cold. Other people register as potential allies, enemies, competitors, or objects of desire. Everything is filtered through the question, how does this relate to me and my purposes? This utilitarian consciousness is the will operating through you, constantly evaluating everything as means to your ends. Aesthetic consciousness is different. You look at a painting and stop asking what it is for. The image before you ceases to be an object with uses and becomes pure visual form. Colors, shapes, composition. These become absorbing in themselves. You forget yourself, your needs, your purposes. You exist as pure awareness directed at the object. Nothing else matters. This is aesthetic contemplation. The same transformation can occur with natural objects. You see a tree in a forest. Normally, you might note it as firewood, building material, or pleasant shade, but in aesthetic perception, all such thoughts fall away. You see the tree itself, the way light catches leaves, the pattern of branches, the texture of bark, the tree's particular way of being. You are absorbed in perception, forgetting that you are a wanting subject with needs and plans. This absorption brings peace. When you are not wanting anything, you are not suffering. The pressure of unsatisfied desire lifts. The anxiety about the future disappears. The regrets about the past fall silent. You exist entirely in the present moment, perceiving without needing. This state is what Schopenhauer called will-less perception, and it is the closest most people come to genuine happiness. Different art forms facilitate this state in different ways. Visual arts, painting, sculpture, photography, work through the eyes, presenting visual forms that can absorb attention. A great painting draws you in, making you forget where you are and who you are. You become lost in the image. Time stops. Nothing exists except the colors, lines, and forms before you. Literature works through imagination. A novel creates a world that you enter mentally. When genuinely absorbed in a story, you forget your own life. You see through the characters' eyes, feel their emotions, inhabit their situations. This is not escapism in a trivial sense. It is temporarily inhabiting a perspective other than your own ego's perspective, which provides relief from the prison of selfhood. Poetry achieves aesthetic experience through concentrated language. A perfect line or image can stop you, forcing attention away from utilitarian concerns toward pure perception. The best poetry presents images or ideas in ways that make the familiar strange, that reveal aspects of experience usually overlooked, that cut through habitual perception to show things as they are. Drama and theater present human action in concentrated form. Watching a play, you observe human passions, conflicts, and character without being personally involved. This creates aesthetic distance. You are emotionally engaged but not personally threatened. You see clearly without the distortions that come from being caught up in your own drama. Great theater illuminates human nature by presenting it at sufficient remove that pure perception becomes possible. Architecture operates differently because it is not primarily observed from outside but experienced from within. A cathedral or a well-designed space does not represent anything. It creates an environment that affects consciousness. Great architecture can induce the same state of will-less contemplation by surrounding you with forms that demand attention, that lift awareness beyond practical concerns toward pure spatial and formal experience. Schopenhauer distinguished between genuine art and mere craft or entertainment. Not everything called art produces aesthetic experience. Much painting is merely decorative. Much fiction is mere diversion. Much music is background noise. The difference lies in whether the work has the power to lift consciousness out of willing into pure perception. Great art does this. Mediocre art fails to do it. Bad art actively prevents it by pandering to the will rather than quieting it. He also recognized that aesthetic experience requires appropriate conditions. You cannot perceive aesthetically when desperately hungry or in severe pain. Immediate physical needs override aesthetic capacity. You also cannot perceive aesthetically when rushed or distracted. Aesthetic contemplation requires time and attention. You must be able to give yourself to the object, to let it fill consciousness without forcing the experience. This means that leisure is necessary for aesthetic experience, which has implications for social organization. If people are worked to exhaustion or kept in constant anxiety about survival, they cannot access art's benefits. A society that makes aesthetic experience available only to a privileged few while keeping most people trapped in mere survival is failing its members. Art should be accessible to everyone because everyone needs relief from willing. The artist occupies a special position. Artists are people with unusual capacity for aesthetic perception. They can enter the state of will-less contemplation more easily and sustain it longer than most. This capacity is what talent consists in. A talented painter sees forms and colors with unusual clarity. A talented writer perceives human character and emotion with unusual depth. A talented composer hears musical relationships that others miss. But talent alone is not enough. The artist must also have technical skill to embody what they perceive in a form others can experience. This is why great art is rare. It requires both the capacity for deep aesthetic perception and the ability to create works that can induce similar perception in others. The artist must perceive the eternal idea in the particular thing and then create a particular work that reveals that idea to others. Genius, for Schopenhauer, is precisely this combination of profound aesthetic perception and the ability to communicate it. Geniuses are people who can sustain will-less perception long enough to create works that embody timeless truths. Shakespeare, Goethe, Beethoven, Michelangelo. These are people who perceive deeply and had the skill to share what they perceived. Their works provide others access to insights that might otherwise be impossible. He distinguished genius from talent and from mere intelligence. Intelligence is the capacity to grasp relations between things, to reason effectively, to solve problems. This is valuable, but not the same as genius. Genius is the capacity to perceive ideas, to see the eternal in the temporal, to grasp essence rather than merely analyzing relations. Many intelligent people lack genius. Some geniuses have only moderate intelligence. Experiencing art does not solve the problem of existence permanently. When you leave the concert hall or close the book, willing returns. You are pulled back into the world of needs and purposes. The aesthetic peace was temporary, but these temporary respites matter. They provide relief, however brief. They demonstrate that escape from willing is possible. They give hints of what complete liberation would be like. Schopenhauer also believed that repeated aesthetic experiences can gradually weaken the will's grip. If you regularly experience states where willing falls silent, the will's demands become less tyrannical. You develop capacity to step back from your desires, to observe them with some detachment rather than being completely identified with them. Art trains consciousness to be something other than merely the will's servant. This is why he considered art an essential part of any life lived well. Philosophy can provide intellectual understanding of the human condition. Compassion can provide ethical guidance. Ascetic practice can provide more complete will denial. But art provides something none of these can: direct, immediate experience of what existence is like when the will falls silent. This experience is more convincing than any argument because you live it directly. Modern life provides constant distraction, but little genuine aesthetic experience. Entertainment is abundant, but entertainment is not the same as art. Entertainment typically serves the will, providing pleasure and diversion. Art opposes the will, demanding attention and offering peace rather than pleasure. The person who fills their life with entertainment but never experiences art is denying themselves one of the few reliable sources of relief from suffering. Schopenhauer's account of art explains phenomena that other theories struggle with. Why do people seek out tragedy and drama when tragedy involves suffering? Because aesthetic distance transforms suffering into contemplation. You perceive suffering without experiencing it directly, which allows clear sight of truths usually obscured by personal involvement. Why does great art often focus on dark themes? Because art that honestly depicts existence must acknowledge suffering as central, and honesty itself has aesthetic value. His theory also explains why some art affects us so powerfully while leaving others indifferent. Different people have different capacities for aesthetic perception. Some are more readily lifted out of willing into contemplation. Some have deeper sensitivity to particular art forms. This is not purely subjective. The work of genius genuinely embodies eternal ideas. But recognizing those ideas requires corresponding capacity in the perceiver. Art cannot eliminate suffering, but it can make suffering more bearable. It provides regular proof that existence contains more than endless wanting. It offers experiences of peace that demonstrate that peace is possible. It connects us to the greatest achievements of human consciousness, reminding us that humans are capable of transcending their animal nature. In a life structured by suffering, art is not luxury or decoration. It is necessity, one of the few things that makes existence endurable. Retrium dulce he, death is nothing, so stop worrying about it. The fear of death haunts human existence. People spend enormous energy avoiding death, denying death, and worrying about death. They organize religions around promises of immortality. They create elaborate rituals to manage death's presence. They feel profound anxiety at the thought of their own non-existence. Schopenhauer looked at this universal fear and called it irrational. Death is not something to fear. It is, in fact, nothing at all. His argument began with a simple question: what exactly do you fear when you fear death? The most common answer is annihilation, the end of existence, the permanent loss of consciousness and experience. You will cease to be. Everything you are will disappear. This prospect terrifies most people. But Schopenhauer asked, what is the difference between the state after death and the state before birth? Before you were born, you did not exist. For billions of years, you were not. Did this bother you? Did you suffer from non-existence before 1788 or whenever you were born? Obviously not. You cannot suffer when you do not exist. The period before your birth was characterized by absolute absence of experience. You were not there to mind being absent. Death returns you to exactly this state. After you die, you will not exist. You will not experience anything. There will be no you to experience absence or loss. Death is not a state you will be in. It is the absence of states entirely. If the infinite period before your birth was not problematic, why should the infinite period after your death be problematic? They are identical. Both are non-existence. People respond that death is different because they have now experienced existence and will lose it, whereas before birth they had not yet experienced existence. This asymmetry feels significant, but Schopenhauer insisted it is not. The loss of existence is only painful while you exist to anticipate it. Once you are dead, you are not there to experience loss. The suffering associated with death is entirely in the anticipation, not in the reality. He compared it to going to sleep without dreams. When you are deeply asleep, you do not exist as a conscious subject. Hours pass of which you have no experience. This does not trouble you because while asleep, you are not there to be troubled. Death is simply sleep without waking. If dreamless sleep is not frightening, death should not be frightening. The fear of death, then, is a confusion. What you actually fear is not death itself, but dying, the process of getting to death. Dying can involve pain, disability, loss of control, indignity. These are legitimate concerns, but they are concerns about experiences while alive, not about the state of being dead. Once the dying process ends, there is nothing to fear because there is no one to experience anything. You might also fear the effects of your death on others, the grief of loved ones, responsibilities left unfulfilled, projects left incomplete. These are legitimate concerns about consequences in the world. But again, these are not fears about your own non-existence. They are concerns about states of affairs that will exist after you do not. Once you are dead, you will not witness others' grief or unfulfilled obligations. You will not be there to regret anything. Schopenhauer's metaphysics provided deeper grounds for not fearing death. If you are, at the deepest level, not your individual personality, but a manifestation of the universal will, then your death does not eliminate what you fundamentally are. The will continues. It simply ceases manifesting in your particular form. The ocean loses a wave but remains ocean. The will loses an individual manifestation but remains will. This is not personal immortality in any meaningful sense. Your memories, personality, and individual consciousness disappear completely at death. Nothing of what makes you distinctively you survives. But the inner nature that you are, the will itself, is not born and does not die. It is timeless. Your appearance in time is temporary, but the reality you are a manifestation of is eternal. He acknowledged that this is cold comfort to most people. They want personal survival, not merely the continuation of an impersonal force. But Schopenhauer insisted that personal survival is impossible and that desiring it reflects misunderstanding. You are not actually a separate, independent being. You are a temporary form the will takes. Wanting to preserve this form forever is wanting something incoherent, like wanting a wave to exist independently of the ocean. Moreover, personal immortality would be terrible if you think it through. Imagine existing forever as yourself. Everything you can experience, you eventually will experience. Everything you can think, you eventually will think. Existence would become unbearably repetitive. You would exhaust novelty. Boredom would become infinite. The only thing worse than death would be the inability to die. Religious promises of heaven try to address this by imagining an eternal state of perfect happiness, but Schopenhauer's analysis shows this is incoherent. Happiness, as humans experience it, is always the satisfaction of desire or the relief from pain. In a state without any lack or suffering, what would happiness consist in? Perfect bliss is either unconsciousness, which is death by another name, or it is a state so different from human experience that calling it you surviving is meaningless. He observed that nature clearly does not care about individual survival. Every organism dies. New organisms replace them. The cycle continues endlessly. Nature is profligate with individuals, creating them by the billions and allowing them to perish without concern. This should tell you something about your own importance in the cosmic scheme. You are not special. Your survival is not the universe's priority. Accepting this is not depressing. It is realistic. The fear of death also reveals the will's tyranny. The will wants to continue existing in individual forms. It generates the fear of death to keep organisms struggling to survive. This fear is the will's mechanism for perpetuating itself. When you fear death, you are feeling the will's drive for continuation, not responding to a genuine threat to anything that matters. The fear is a tool the will uses, not a reflection of reality. Understanding this can weaken death's grip. When you recognize that death anxiety is the will manipulating you, you can observe the fear with detachment. You still feel it. You cannot eliminate it while alive, but you do not have to believe it corresponds to a genuine problem. The fear is real, but what it points to is nothing. There is no problem of death, only the will's insistence that there is. Schopenhauer noted that people who accomplish something significant often face death more calmly. Having created something that outlasts them, they are less attached to personal survival. The artist whose works will endure, the thinker whose ideas will influence future generations, the parent who raised children successfully, these people have, in a sense, transcended individual existence by contributing to something larger. This does not eliminate death, but it removes some of its sting. He also pointed to the observation that fear of death often decreases with age. Young people, full of vitality and desires, cling to life desperately. Older people, having satisfied or exhausted most desires, often become more accepting of death. This is not merely resignation, it reflects the natural arc of willing. As the will's intensity decreases, the fear of its cessation decreases proportionally. In some cases, death comes as relief. People suffering from severe, incurable pain often welcome death. The wish for death in such circumstances is rational, not pathological. If existence has become unbearable suffering with no prospect of relief, why prolong it? The assumption that life must be preserved at all costs reflects attachment to existence that Schopenhauer's philosophy questions. If existence is fundamentally suffering, death is not the enemy. Continued suffering is. This does not mean suicide is rational. Schopenhauer had already argued that suicide is not genuine will denial, but rather an expression of the will. The person wants a different life, not the end of life as such. But it does mean that accepting death when it comes naturally, without desperate attempts to prolong existence indefinitely, is rational. Medical technology now allows extraordinary extension of dying. Whether this is wise depends on whether the extended time contains anything valuable or merely prolongs suffering. Philosophical acceptance of death can be cultivated through regular reflection. Memento mori, remember you will die, is not morbid but clarifying. Keeping death in awareness helps prioritize what matters. If you have limited time, you waste less of it on trivia. If death can come unexpectedly, you appreciate present moments more fully. Death's certainty makes choices meaningful. In a finite life, what you do actually matters because you cannot do everything. Schopenhauer practiced what he preached here. As he aged, he showed no particular fear of death. He continued working until near the end. He made practical arrangements for his estate calmly. When death came, it came peacefully. He died sitting in his chair, apparently without struggle or terror. For a man who had spent his life analyzing suffering, the end was as gentle as one could hope. His account of death faces several objections. First, even if death itself is nothing, the process of dying is something, and it is often unpleasant. This is fair, but it does not undermine his main point. Fear the process if you must, but do not fear the state of being dead. Second, people reasonably fear premature death, dying before having lived fully. Schopenhauer would likely agree that dying young is unfortunate, not because death itself is bad, but because potential experiences are missed. But note that the dead person does not suffer from this. Only the living, contemplating what might have been, find it tragic. Third, people fear losing consciousness permanently because consciousness is all they know. The prospect of permanent unconsciousness feels like total loss. Schopenhauer's response is that you already experience unconsciousness every night in dreamless sleep. You cease to exist as a conscious subject for hours at a time. This does not harm you. Death is the same, merely permanent. If temporary unconsciousness is acceptable, why is permanent unconsciousness intolerable? His position is challenging because it removes one of humanity's most powerful motivations, the desire to avoid death. If death is nothing to fear, what keeps people striving? Schopenhauer would say this reveals the problem. We strive because the will drives us, not because striving serves our genuine interests. Removing fear of death does not remove all motivation. It removes one source of anxiety and allows clearer focus on what actually matters during the limited time we have. Modern existential philosophy has wrestled with similar themes. Heidegger wrote about being toward death as constitutive of authentic existence. Sartre discussed death as absolute absurdity. Camus called suicide the only serious philosophical question. These thinkers, coming after Schopenhauer, developed his insight that death's inevitability shapes human existence fundamentally. They disagreed about implications, but they shared Schopenhauer's rejection of comfortable religious answers. Contemporary psychology recognizes terror management theory, the idea that much human behavior is driven by fear of death and attempts to deny mortality through cultural worldviews and self-esteem. This empirical research confirms Schopenhauer's observation that death anxiety shapes life profoundly. It also suggests that accepting death, rather than denying it, might enable more authentic living. His account of death is among his most consoling teachings. In a philosophy centered on suffering, death emerges not as the greatest evil, but as the natural end of a difficult process. You did not exist for infinite time before birth. You will not exist for infinite time after death. Between these infinities is a brief flicker of conscious existence, mostly characterized by wanting and suffering. When the flicker ends, you return to the peace of non-existence. This is not tragedy, it is simply how things are. The wise person accepts it without protest or fear. Asceticism, the ultimate, but impossible, solution. After analyzing suffering, explaining its source in the will, and describing temporary escapes through art and compassion, Schopenhauer turned to the ultimate question. Is complete liberation possible? His answer was yes, in principle, through asceticism, the systematic denial of the will to live. But he also acknowledged that this path is extraordinarily difficult, and perhaps impossible for most people. Asceticism represents the theoretical ideal toward which his philosophy points, even if few can actually reach it. The ascetic is someone who has seen through the illusion of individuality and recognized that all willing leads only to suffering. This recognition is not merely intellectual, it is a profound transformation of consciousness. The ascetic no longer experiences desires as their own desires, or the satisfaction of desires as genuine goods. They see clearly that the will is the enemy, that as long as they will suffer, and that the only solution is to stop willing. This does not mean stopping all action. Even the ascetic must eat, sleep, and maintain minimal bodily functions. But these actions are performed without attachment, without the sense that they serve the self's interests. The ascetic eats to quiet hunger, not because they desire food or find pleasure in eating. They continue existing in the world, but are no longer of the world. They have withdrawn inner consent from the will's demands. Schopenhauer drew heavily on examples from religious traditions, particularly Christianity, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Christian saints, Buddhist monks, Hindu sannyasis, all represent varying degrees of successful will denial. They renounce worldly goods, sexual activity, social ambition, and personal comfort. They practice poverty, chastity, and obedience not as arbitrary rules, but as methods for weakening the will's grip on consciousness. Sexual renunciation is particularly important because sexuality is the will's most powerful mechanism for perpetuating itself. The sex drive is intense, urgent, and difficult to ignore. It directs enormous energy toward reproduction. The person who successfully renounces sexual activity cuts off the will's primary means of continuing through new generations. This is why genuine ascetics are celibate. They refuse to participate in the will's reproductive scheme. Poverty is important because attachment to possessions strengthens the will. The desire for wealth, the fear of loss, the time spent managing property, all of this keeps consciousness trapped in willing. The ascetic who owns nothing escapes these concerns. They cannot lose what they do not have. They do not waste energy on acquisition or maintenance. Their attention is freed for the inner work of will denial. Fasting and other physical austerities serve to weaken the body's demands. The well-fed, comfortable body makes constant demands for more food, for pleasant sensations, for ease. These demands are the will operating through physical needs. By maintaining the body in a state of slight discomfort through fasting, simple diet, and physical hardship, the ascetic reduces the body's voice in consciousness. The will's physical manifestation is weakened. Solitude is necessary because other people constantly evoke willing. Social interaction involves comparison, competition, desire for approval, fear of judgment. The ascetic withdraws from society not from hatred, but from recognition that society reinforces willing. In isolation, many of the will's typical triggers are absent. Consciousness can quiet more easily. The ultimate state the ascetic seeks is complete willlessness. This is not unconsciousness or death. It is conscious existence without desire. The ascetic continues to be aware but no longer wants anything. They experience reality directly, without the filter of personal interest. They see things as they are, rather than as means to ends. This state is occasionally glimpsed in aesthetic experience or compassionate action, but the ascetic seeks to make it permanent. Schopenhauer called this state the denial of the will to live. It is not suicide, that would be an act of will. It is the gradual withdrawal of the will's energy until willing simply ceases. The person continues living, but no longer in service to the will. They become, in a sense, already dead while still breathing. This is the closest thing to salvation his philosophy offers. He was honest about how rare this achievement is. Most people never seriously attempt it. The will is too strong, life's pleasures too attractive, comfort too important. Even people who intellectually accept Schopenhauer's philosophy continue living willfully. They pursue careers, relationships, pleasures. They know that willing leads to suffering, but they will anyway because they cannot help it. The will drives them despite their understanding. Among those who do attempt ascetic practice, most fail or achieve only partial success. They renounce some desires but remain attached to others. They practice for a time but eventually return to worldly life. Genuine, complete, permanent will denial is almost impossibly difficult. It requires not just discipline, but a fundamental transformation of consciousness that few can achieve. Schopenhauer pointed to figures like saints and spiritual masters as examples of successful ascetics. Francis of Assisi renounced wealth and lived in radical poverty, treating all creatures with compassion. The Buddha achieved enlightenment and taught the path of desire cessation. Hindu ascetics who wander owning nothing, attached to nothing, represent the ideal. But these figures are rare across all of human history. They prove the possibility of will denial, but also show how exceptional it is. He also noted that ascetic achievement cannot be taught or forced. You cannot decide to become an ascetic through an act of will. That would be contradictory, using will to deny will. Asceticism arises when consciousness spontaneously sees through willing and cannot continue willing with conviction. It is grace or transformation, not achievement. This makes it even more uncertain and rare. The question arises, if almost no one can achieve ascetic will denial, what is the point of presenting it as the solution? Schopenhauer acknowledged this problem. His answer was that the ideal still matters even if rarely achieved. It shows the direction consciousness should move. It identifies what genuine liberation would consist in, and even partial movement toward will denial provides relief proportional to the degree achieved. Most people cannot become complete ascetics, but they can practice elements of ascetic discipline. They can simplify their lives, reducing attachments and desires. They can practice periods of renunciation, fasting, solitude, minimal living. They can cultivate detachment from outcomes while continuing to act. These practices do not eliminate the will, but they weaken its grip and provide more frequent moments of peace. He also suggested that intellectual understanding of the will's nature serves a quasi-ascetic function. When you clearly see that your desires are not truly yours, but the will operating through you, you create distance from them. You still feel desires, but you observe them with detachment rather than identifying with them completely. This is not full liberation, but it is movement in that direction. The person who practices compassion regularly is also moving toward will denial. Compassion involves forgetting your own interests and feeling another's suffering as primary. This is temporary will denial. The more frequently you experience it, the more natural it becomes. A life structured around compassionate action is closer to ascetic will denial than a life structured around personal ambition. Engagement with art provides another form of partial will denial. Regular aesthetic experience trains consciousness to exist without willing. The person who makes art or aesthetic appreciation central to their life experiences more moments of willlessness than the person who focuses only on practical concerns. These moments accumulate, gradually shifting consciousness toward the state ascetics achieve more completely. Schopenhauer's own life was not ascetic in the full sense. He lived comfortably, managed his wealth carefully, and never renounced worldly existence. He did not fast, did not practice poverty, and did not abstain from sexual activity. He was a philosopher who understood asceticism intellectually but did not practice it completely. This might be seen as hypocrisy or as realistic acknowledgement of human limitations. He would likely say that he presented the philosophical truth without claiming to have fully embodied it. Philosophy can identify the ideal even when the philosopher falls short. The validity of the analysis does not depend on the philosopher's personal achievement. This is a reasonable position, though it leaves open the question of whether someone who has not experienced full will denial can accurately describe it. The ascetic solution also raises ethical questions. If the goal is will denial, and if reproduction perpetuates willing, then the logical conclusion is that humanity should cease reproducing and gradually go extinct. Schopenhauer essentially accepted this conclusion. If everyone became ascetic, humanity would end, and this would be good because it would mean less suffering. The will would cease manifesting in human form. Most people find this conclusion horrifying. The extinction of humanity seems like the ultimate catastrophe, but from Schopenhauer's perspective, it would be the ultimate triumph, the end of human suffering. Since human life is primarily suffering, more human life means more suffering. Less human life means less suffering. No human life means no human suffering. The mathematics is simple if you accept his premises. This is perhaps where his philosophy becomes most challenging and where many readers part ways with him. Even those who accept that life involves much suffering usually believe that life also contains enough value to justify continuation. Schopenhauer's position implies that it does not, that the only truly ethical stance is working toward the gradual cessation of life through voluntary non-reproduction. Contemporary antinatalism, the philosophical position that having children is wrong, echoes Schopenhauer's reasoning. Antinatalists argue that creating a new person guarantees that person will suffer, and since non-existent people cannot be deprived of existence's benefits, it is better not to create them. This is Schopenhauer's position, though most antinatalists do not go as far as advocating for universal ascetic will denial. The ascetic path represents Schopenhauer's philosophy at its most extreme and uncompromising. It follows logically from his premises. If the will is the source of suffering, and if suffering outweighs any possible satisfaction, then the rational response is will denial. If will denial is only fully achieved through ascetic practice, then asceticism is the only complete solution. But the path's extreme difficulty, The rarity of its achievement and the questionable value of its goal suggest limits to Schopenhauer's system. Perhaps life is not as thoroughly dominated by suffering as he claimed. Perhaps there are goods in existence that balance or outweigh its pains. Perhaps the will is not as uniformly negative as he suggested. These questions remain open, and his acknowledgement that asceticism is nearly impossible might indicate that his own philosophy recognized limits it could not theoretically accommodate. For most readers, the ascetic solution functions not as a practical path but as a theoretical endpoint that illuminates the overall philosophy. It shows where Schopenhauer's logic leads if followed completely. It identifies what total liberation would require. But it also, by its very extremity, suggests that complete liberation may not be achievable or even desirable for most people. The value of the philosophy may lie not in its ultimate solution, but in its analysis of the problem and its description of partial reliefs, art, compassion, understanding, that make existence more bearable without requiring complete renunciation. His ghost in modern thought, Freud, Nietzsche, Jung, and beyond. Schopenhauer died in 1860, but his ideas did not die with him. In the decades following his death, his influence spread through European intellectual culture. Thinkers who might never have acknowledged him during his lifetime now claimed him as a predecessor. His concepts appeared in new forms across philosophy, psychology, literature, and art. His ghost haunted modern thought in ways he could not have anticipated. The influence began with Richard Wagner. The composer encountered Schopenhauer's work in the 1850s and declared it a revelation. Wagner's mature operas, particularly Tristan und Isolde and the Ring cycle, are saturated with Schopenhauerian themes. The Ring depicts the will to power destroying those it possesses. Tristan explores sexual desire as cosmic force and death as release. Wagner's theoretical writings explicitly acknowledge Schopenhauer as a primary influence, introducing the philosopher to broader audiences through association with successful art. Friedrich Nietzsche was profoundly shaped by Schopenhauer before eventually rejecting him. As a young man, Nietzsche read the world as will and representation and found it thrilling. He embraced Schopenhauer's metaphysics, his critique of optimism, and his aesthetic theory. His early work, The Birth of Tragedy, is essentially Schopenhauerian, analyzing Greek drama through concepts of will and aesthetic redemption. But Nietzsche eventually turned against his teacher. He came to see Schopenhauer's pessimism as life-denying, his ascetic ideal as nihilistic, his compassion-based ethics as weakness. Nietzsche's mature philosophy affirmed life despite suffering, celebrated strength rather than compassion, and rejected will denial in favor of will to power. Yet even in rejection, Nietzsche remained in dialogue with Schopenhauer. His concepts are often inversions or transformations of Schopenhauerian ideas. The anxiety of influence is palpable. The most significant relationship is between Schopenhauer and Sigmund Freud. Freud explicitly acknowledged Schopenhauer as a predecessor who had anticipated psychoanalytic discoveries through philosophical insight. The similarities are striking. Schopenhauer's will corresponds closely to Freud's unconscious drives, particularly the ID. Both thinkers saw human behavior as driven by forces beneath conscious awareness. Both emphasized sexuality as a primary driver. Both noted that consciousness rationalizes rather than determines action. Schopenhauer's analysis of self-deception, of the gap between how we see ourselves and what actually motivates us, anticipates Freudian concepts of repression and defense mechanisms. His observation that we do not choose our desires but discover them within ourselves parallels Freud's view that unconscious wishes determine behavior. His claim that reason is the will's servant prefigures Freud's famous statement that the ego is not master in its own house. The differences are also important. Freud was a scientist building empirical theories, while Schopenhauer was a metaphysician making claims about reality itself. Freud sought therapeutic interventions to help patients, while Schopenhauer offered philosophical understanding without clinical application. Freud maintained hope that psychoanalysis could reduce suffering, while Schopenhauer was more pessimistic about the possibility of fundamental change. Carl Jung was influenced both directly by Schopenhauer and indirectly through Nietzsche. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious has Schopenhauerian resonances, a deep impersonal layer of psyche shared by all humans operating beneath individual consciousness. Jung's emphasis on individuation as a spiritual process shows Schopenhauer's influence, though Jung was more optimistic about the process's outcome. Jung saw the unconscious as containing not just destructive drives, but also wisdom and potential for growth. In literature, Schopenhauer's influence was enormous. Thomas Mann called himself a Schopenhauerian and filled his novels with philosophical themes. The Magic Mountain explores time, desire, and death in explicitly Schopenhauerian terms. Buddenbrook's chronicles a family's decline through generations, illustrating the will's destructive operation. Mann's intellectual heroes are often figures who achieve aesthetic or contemplative distance from willing. Leo Tolstoy encountered Schopenhauer late in life and found his ideas profoundly affecting. Tolstoy's later works, particularly The Death of Ivan Ilyich and his religious writings, grapple with suffering, death, and the search for meaning in ways that echo Schopenhauer. Tolstoy's turn toward ascetic Christianity and his critique of conventional society shows Schopenhauerian influence, though Tolstoy retained religious faith that Schopenhauer lacked. Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time is thoroughly Schopenhauerian in its treatment of memory, desire, and aesthetic experience. The novel's famous moments of involuntary memory, when past suddenly becomes present through sensory triggers, function as escapes from willing through pure perception. Proust's analysis of love as projection and disappointment, of social life as performance, and of art as redemption all have Schopenhauerian roots. In philosophy, Schopenhauer influenced the development of existentialism and phenomenology. His emphasis on lived experience rather than abstract system, his focus on suffering and death, his skepticism about reason's power, all these themes reappear in 20th century existential thought. Heidegger's analysis of being toward death, Sartre's emphasis on anguish and bad faith, Camus' confrontation with absurdity, all build on foundations Schopenhauer laid. Ludwig Wittgenstein read Schopenhauer early and absorbed influences that shaped his philosophical development. Wittgenstein's mysticism, his sense that the most important matters cannot be spoken, his distinction between what can be said and what can only be shown, these have Schopenhauerian roots. The Tractatus's famous concluding silence echoes Schopenhauer's view that the deepest truths exceed conceptual expression. In Psychology Beyond Freud, Schopenhauer's insights found various applications. Evolutionary psychology's emphasis on unconscious drives shaped by selection pressures parallels Schopenhauer's analysis of the will's operation. Terror management theory and social psychology explores death anxiety's effects on behavior, developing empirically what Schopenhauer described philosophically. Positive psychology's findings about hedonic adaptation, the tendency to return to baseline happiness despite positive changes, confirm Schopenhauer's claim that satisfaction is always temporary. The pessimistic tradition in philosophy traces directly to Schopenhauer. Later pessimists like Eduard von Hartmann, Julius Bonson, and Philip Mainlander built explicit systems developing his ideas. Contemporary pessimists like Eugene Thacker and Thomas Ligotti continue the tradition, applying Schopenhauerian analysis to modern conditions. The recent philosophical interest in pessimism and antinatalism shows Schopenhauer's continued relevance. Buddhist philosophy's reception in the West was significantly shaped by Schopenhauer. He was among the first Western thinkers to take Buddhism seriously as philosophy rather than merely as exotic religion. His interpretation emphasized Buddhism's pessimistic and ascetic aspects, which influenced how later Western audiences understood Buddhism. Some scholars argue he misread Buddhism by emphasizing life denial over liberation's positive aspects, but his role in making Buddhism philosophically respectable in the West is undeniable. Feminist thinkers have engaged critically with Schopenhauer, condemning his misogyny while sometimes finding value in other aspects of his work. His analysis of desire, suffering, and the will's tyranny has been reappropriated by some feminist philosophers to critique patriarchal structures that trap women in particular forms of suffering. His ethics of compassion has been connected to feminist care ethics, though with the sexism excised. In popular culture, Schopenhauer appears less directly, but his themes pervade modern consciousness. The idea that life is suffering, that desire leads to disappointment, that meaning must be created rather than discovered. These pessimistic or existential themes that dominate modern literature, film, and music all owe something to Schopenhauer's articulation of them in philosophical form. The question of whether Schopenhauer's influence has been beneficial is complex. He helped Western thought confront uncomfortable truths about suffering, unconscious motivation, and the limits of reason. He provided conceptual tools for understanding psychological and existential phenomena. He inspired great art and profound philosophy. But his influence has also had costs. His pessimism can become paralyzing. His emphasis on suffering can obscure life's genuine goods. His misogyny was transmitted to later thinkers who might have avoided it without his example. His philosophy can be used to justify resignation and passivity rather than to inspire meaningful action or reform. His lasting contribution may be methodological as much as substantive. He showed that philosophy could confront the darkest aspects of existence without flinching, could describe suffering honestly without offering false comfort, could follow logic to uncomfortable conclusions rather than stopping at socially acceptable answers. This intellectual courage influenced thinkers across disciplines to be more honest about difficult truths. The ghost of Schopenhauer continues to haunt contemporary thought because the problems he addressed remain unsolved. Suffering persists. Desire continues to drive behavior beneath conscious awareness. Death remains inevitable and frightening. The gap between how life is and how we wish it to be has not closed. As long as these realities characterize human existence, Schopenhauer's analysis will remain relevant, and his ghost will continue walking through the corridors of modern thought. How to live well, according to a pessimist. After identifying life as suffering, after explaining the will's tyranny, after describing temporary escapes through art and compassion, after acknowledging that complete ascetic liberation is nearly impossible for most people, what practical wisdom did Schopenhauer offer for living well? He collected these insights in essays on the wisdom of life, presenting a guide for minimizing suffering and maximizing peace within the constraints of ordinary existence. The foundation is recognizing that you cannot eliminate suffering entirely. The will operates through you as long as you live. Desires will arise, frustrations will occur, pain will visit. Accepting this reality without resentment is the first step toward wisdom. Do not waste energy on impossible goals like permanent happiness or perfect satisfaction. These do not exist. Focus instead on minimizing suffering and achieving occasional moments of peace. The second principle is understanding what you can and cannot control. You cannot control your character. It was given to you by factors beyond your choice. You cannot control many external circumstances. You cannot control other people's behavior or opinions. You cannot control whether you will become ill, suffer losses, or face misfortune. Accepting these limits reduces wasted effort and unnecessary suffering. What you can control to some degree is how you respond to circumstances, where you direct attention, what you pursue, and how you structure your life. These are the domains where wisdom applies. Make choices that reduce rather than increase suffering. Avoid obvious sources of pain where possible. Create conditions that allow for moments of peace and aesthetic experience. Schopenhauer recommended living simply. Minimize material possessions and material desires. The more you own, the more you must maintain, protect, and worry about. The more you desire expensive things, the more you will suffer when you cannot afford them or when you lose them. Simple living reduces the will's grip by reducing the things that trigger wanting. This does not mean embrace poverty if you have wealth. Schopenhauer himself lived comfortably on inherited money. It means not letting wealth or the pursuit of wealth dominate life. Use resources to create conditions for peace, quiet space for work, freedom from financial anxiety, access to art and books. But do not confuse wealth with happiness or spend life chasing more than you need. Regarding health, take reasonable precautions, but do not become obsessed. Health is the foundation for everything else. When you are in severe pain or illness, nothing else matters. Maintain your body through reasonable diet, exercise, and rest. But avoid hypochondria, the excessive worry about health that makes you suffer from imagined illnesses before real ones arrive. On work and career, choose activities that absorb your attention and provide intrinsic satisfaction rather than pursuing only money or status. Work that engages your mind protects against boredom and provides structure, but do not sacrifice everything to ambition. Professional success does not bring lasting satisfaction and often costs more in stress and effort than it provides in genuine benefit. Regarding relationships, maintain independence. Do not become emotionally dependent on others' approval or presence. The hedgehog's dilemma is real. Intimacy brings both warmth and pricks. Find a balance that works for you, but err on the side of independence. You cannot control whether others will remain in your life or continue loving you. The less you depend on them for your well-being, the less you will suffer when relationships change. Practice solitude regularly. Time alone is not deprivation, but opportunity. Use solitude for intellectual work, aesthetic experience, and contemplation. Develop the capacity to be contentedly alone. This protects you from the suffering that comes from desperate sociability and from dependence on others for entertainment and meaning. Be selective about friendships. A few genuine connections are worth more than many shallow acquaintances. Seek people who share your values and interests, who can engage in substantive conversation, who respect independence. Avoid people who create drama, demand constant attention, or drag you into conflicts and complications. Minimize exposure to sources of irritation. Schopenhauer's extreme sensitivity to noise was personal, but the principle is sound. Identify what bothers you and structure your environment to minimize it. If crowds disturb you, avoid them. If certain people irritate you, limit contact. If particular activities cause stress, reduce them. You cannot eliminate all irritation, but you can reduce it significantly through thoughtful choices. Cultivate aesthetic appreciation. Make art central to life. Read great literature. Listen to music daily. Visit museums. Observe nature. Aesthetic experience provides the most reliable relief from willing. A life that includes regular aesthetic moments is better than a life focused entirely on practical concerns. Practice compassion when it arises naturally. Do not force it or guilt yourself when it is absent, but when you feel genuine compassion for another's suffering, act on it. Compassionate action provides relief from self-absorption and connects you to something beyond personal desire. But distinguish genuine compassion from mere obligation or people-pleasing. Manage expectations ruthlessly. Most suffering comes from the gap between what you expect and what occurs. Lower expectations and you lower suffering. This is not pessimism as gloom, but pessimism as protection. Expect difficulties. Assume plans will encounter obstacles. Anticipate that people will disappoint you. When things go better than expected, you will be pleasantly surprised. When they go worse, you will be prepared. Do not pursue fame or social status. These are pure vanity, dependent entirely on others' fickle opinions. They provide no genuine satisfaction and typically cost enormous effort and anxiety. The fame Schopenhauer eventually achieved came naturally from doing work he valued. He did not chase it directly, and his early life showed that chasing it would have been futile. Accept aging and eventual death without excessive fear. Your time is limited. You will decline physically. You will die. These facts are non-negotiable. Fighting them wastes energy and creates suffering. Better to accept them and focus on living well within the time you have. Read philosophy, particularly the great pessimistic and realistic thinkers. Understanding the human condition intellectually provides perspective that makes difficulties more bearable. When you recognize that everyone suffers, that life's structure guarantees frustration, that your personal problems are universal problems, you suffer less from the illusion that something is uniquely wrong with you. Practice intellectual honesty. See things as they are, not as you wish them to be. This is difficult. The will constantly generates comforting illusions, but clear sight, though often painful initially, ultimately reduces suffering by preventing the worst suffering that comes from acting on false beliefs. Develop a sense of humor about existence. The cosmic absurdity of our situation, that we are temporary manifestations of a blind will, striving for satisfactions that never last, taking ourselves seriously when we are nothing, is darkly funny. Laughter at the human condition's absurdity provides relief without requiring denial of harsh realities. Find small pleasures and appreciate them without clinging. A good meal, a walk in pleasant weather, an interesting conversation, a beautiful sunset. These moments are real even if temporary. Enjoy them when they occur. Do not dismiss them because they do not last, but also do not depend on them or suffer excessively when they end. Maintain routines that provide structure. Schopenhauer's rigid daily schedule was extreme, but some routine helps. Knowing what to expect reduces decision fatigue and creates predictable spaces for activities you value. Routine is particularly useful for protecting time for intellectual or creative work. Be honest about your limitations. You probably cannot become an ascetic saint. You probably will continue desiring things. You probably will suffer disappointments. Accept this. The goal is not perfection, but improvement. A life with less suffering is worth achieving even if you cannot eliminate suffering entirely. Finally, recognize that wisdom is provisional and personal. What works for one person may not work for another. Schopenhauer's advice reflected his temperament: introverted, intellectual, misanthropic. People with different temperaments will find different strategies effective. The key is honest self-assessment. Understand what causes you suffering and what provides relief, then structure life accordingly. The paradox of Schopenhauer's practical wisdom is that it accepts his bleak metaphysics while offering realistic strategies for living tolerably within those constraints. Life is suffering driven by blind will, but this does not make all choices equivalent. Some ways of living minimize suffering more than others. Some activities provide more moments of peace. Some attitudes reduce unnecessary pain. This is wisdom for people who cannot or will not become ascetics, but who recognize that conventional pursuits, wealth, status, pleasure-seeking, do not deliver what they promise. It is wisdom for the middle path between complete renunciation and complete immersion in worldly striving. It acknowledges human limitations while refusing to accept unnecessary suffering. Whether this constitutes living well is debatable. Schopenhauer's own life, isolated, rigid, productive, but loveless, is not obviously admirable, but by his own standards he lived wisely. He minimized suffering through independence and routine. He found meaning in intellectual work. He experienced aesthetic pleasure daily. He maintained his dignity. He achieved what he set out to achieve. If the goal is not happiness but minimized suffering and occasional peace, he succeeded. His practical wisdom remains relevant because the human condition he analyzed has not fundamentally changed. We still desire, we still suffer disappointments, we still struggle with meaning in a universe indifferent to our welfare. The specific sources of suffering may differ, modern anxieties about technology, climate, inequality, but the underlying structure is the same. A life structured around minimizing suffering, cultivating independence, seeking aesthetic experience, and accepting limitations remains as viable now as when Schopenhauer described it.